Chapter 308. Exhilarating Country. Could it be the exhilarating country from Earth? Exhilarating Country was the homeland that Feng Xinjian had come from when he was on Earth. But does exhilarating country have an organization called the titular authority? Moreover, this is something from the ancient era. Why would it be recorded in exhilarating country's language? Looking at the red metal board before him, Feng Xinjian's mind instantly became a little chaotic. He could no longer hear the discussions around him, and he continued to read the content. The words on the metal board were very messy. It was obvious that the person who had written it seemed to be very anxious and nervous, as if he had written it in agitation. Those who see this piece of dragon's scale, remember, do not borrow the powers of demonic gods. Do not borrow the powers of demonic gods. Only the demonic gods themselves can defeat demonic God. Remember, do not let them enter our world. Remember the following sword technique. This will be the key. However, the first few words had been crossed out, making it impossible for others to read the content. It was just a few simple sentences at the beginning. After that, it was a set of sword technique. Feng Xinjian did not look at the sword technique. Instead, he kept on reading the first few sentences. Demonic gods. What is the relationship between them and the evil gods? He suddenly thought of the words his mother had told him through the second prince. Never use magic, prince. Never borrow the powers of the evil gods. What is the relationship between the two? Although he could understand the words on the board, the information contained within it was even more thought-provoking. It was as if one puzzle had turned into even more puzzles. Sighing, Feng Xinjian knew that with the clues he had now, it was impossible for him to understand the cause and effect. He could only lower his head and continue reading the content of the sword technique. The name of this martial technique was the Heaven's Volition sword technique. However, although it was called a sword technique, it was more like a sword intent. There were no specific sword moves, but a sword intent that nurtured the survival of the fittest. This metal board was known as the Dragon's Scale. The introduction to the sword technique did not talk about how to nurture this sword intent. Instead, it talked about how to unlock the encrypted waves on the Dragon's Scale, so that one could absorb the Heaven's Volition sword intent from the Dragon's Scale. There was only one Heaven's Volition sword intent, and it could only be cultivated by one person. Right now, Feng Xinjian had the Zenith Light Sword formation for long-range attacks, Ether Sword Ripples for close combat, Terra Ingurgitation for strength, Boundaries Negation for speed, and even the Prodigious Demolition sword which he had yet to master. In terms of battle prowess, he did not lack sword techniques that he had cultivated. However, the sword art hidden in the Dragon's Scale before him seemed to be hiding a great secret. It piqued his interest and made him want to learn it very much. However, he was not the only one who was interested in this ancient artifact. Just as Feng Xinjian was reading the Dragon's Scale, Sasa, who came from the Eastern Sand region and was known as a sword saint, was also talking to head of department James. Sasa's gaze was burning as he looked at the Dragon's Scale. The reason he was interested in this was because he had read about it before. The Eastern Sand region was located in the extreme east of the empire and was adjacent to the Sand Country in the east. It was constantly harassed by the Sand Country and could be said to be a region of war. There would be endless conflicts of various sizes almost every year, and the knights here would naturally not miss out on battles as well. As a level 29 conferred knight, Sasa was often at the front lines. He would either restrain the experts from the other party or attack some geniuses from the Sand Country. During one of the attacks, he had unintentionally obtained a secret manual from the Sand Country. He was not interested in the martial techniques recorded in the manual, but in the notes at the back of the manual, there was a record of something known as the Dragon's Scale. This was how the author of the secret manual described the Dragon's Scale. In ancient times, huge dragons soared and a dragon king soared into the sky, attempting to engulf the sun and become a god. In order to protect the world, The King of Gods killed the huge dragons and then used the Dragon King's scale armor to record the martial intent. The dragon's scale is divided into many pieces, and the martial intent recorded a secret regarding invincibility in the world. It's said that the first founder of the Sand Country, the heavenly monarch of the Blood Sea, managed to attain a breakthrough to the divine level and achieve great things because he had obtained a piece of the dragon's scale. He had originally treated the content as a myth from the Sand Country and the fantasies of an unsatisfied cultivator. However, the metal plate before him was exactly the same as the dragon's scale in the description. Its color is like blood, alternating between cold and hot. The divine runes were carved on it to retain its meaning, Sasa said to James. Head of department, this thing should be a sword technique that was recorded on paper by an expert from the ancient era who killed ferocious beasts and used their scale armor as a piece of paper. I've analyzed a similar historical site in the eastern sand region before. Let me analyze this as well. As he spoke, he gently stroked the dragon's scale with one hand, scanning its structure with his heaven's perception like an electronic scanner. When he saw many existences that resembled bone cells, his gaze became even more certain. Dragon's scale. It's really a dragon's scale. To think that this thing really exists. I've always thought that those barbarians from the Sand Country had made it up. The heavens are really on my side. With this, I'll have a greater chance of attaining the divine level. Hearing Sasa's request, Head of Department James did not have any objections. It was impossible for him to ignore the request of a level 29 expert. Moreover, in terms of cultivation, Sasa had a higher chance of being able to research the profoundness of the ancient era's relics compared to Fang Xinjian. Therefore, James only gave it some thought before nodding. He looked at Fang Xinjian and said, "Xinjian, you can let Sasa take over this project." He then smiled. "You can also work together with Sasa and gain some experience." To be honest, James's words and actions were all out of good intentions. He was too old and did not have many years left to live. Sasa, on the other hand, was a famous sword in the southeast and had the title of Sword Saint. Not only was he a level 29 conferred knight, but he was also a top-notch existence amongst level 29 conferred knight. Among level 29 experts, there would naturally be differences in strength. Different specialties, the number of synthesized skills, the types of jobs, and their attributes would all allow for a great disparity between experts who were also level 29. People like the first prince, who was about to step into the divine level, were naturally the strongest. All the level 29 experts who were striving for the divine level were in the first echelon. The second prince and the governors from the other 8 regions, who were talented and had a tremendous amount of resources but had yet to find a way to attain the divine level, were slightly weaker and belonged to the second echelon. Below them were the various veteran level 29 expert. They belonged to the third echelon. Below them were the young level 29 conferred knights from the regional academies. They belonged to the fourth echelon. Sasa was a top-notch character amongst the veteran level 29 expert. He was the standard third echelon and could enter the second echelon at any time. He had the chance to be on par with experts at the governor's level. More importantly, James was already old while Sasa was still young. James was now introducing Fang Xinjian to Sasa because he wanted the two of them to get on good terms. Fang Xinjian would be able to receive support and care. However, what James did not know was that Fang Xinjian was also very interested in the dragon scale. However, Fang Xinjian had the confidence that he would be able to absorb the sword intent from it before James revealed the result. Therefore, he did not object to James's suggestion. Chapter 309. There was a lot of competition between knights. From a knight apprentice to a knight, and then to a conferred knight, everyone had to compete their way up. They would fight for resources, rankings, and positions. Every knight was used to all sorts of competition. Sasa, the level 29 Sword Saint of the Southeast, was naturally used to competition. The legendary dragon's scale contained unrivaled profoundness. This was not an ordinary research job, and Sasa would not allow others to get involved. From the very beginning, he had only planned to study the dragon's scale by himself. Therefore, Sasa rejected directly, "There's no need for that. I can study this ancient artifact alone." James said, "How can we do that? This is the first project you're working on in our Great Western region. How can we not give our full support? If others were to find out about this, they'd think that our Great Western Region Regional Academy is jealous of those with talent. There's really no need for that." Sasa rejected once again. Ancient artifacts mainly contain historical information and analysis of ancient cultures. It's useless even if there are more people. I alone will be enough. After being rejected consecutively, James also seemed to sense that something was wrong. He threw a glance at the dragon's scale and asked, "Is it really enough for you alone? You'll need a few assistants to help you with the research, right?" You can give me a few assistants." Sasa did not wish to reject too firmly, but he still added, "But I'd like to keep this ancient artifact in my residence for now and protect it closely. After all, this is an important discovery, and any damage to it would be a great loss." James was about to agree, but Fang Xinjian could not allow Sasa to take the dragon's scale away just like that. Otherwise, how would he be able to absorb the sword intent within it? Therefore, Fang Xinjian said directly, "The sword tower is very safe, and the researchers here are all professionals. There's no need for us to move it." Hearing Fang Xinjian's words, Sasa frowned. He had to explain patiently to James, but why would he need to explain to a little brat? He reprimanded him as a senior. "I've been studying ancient artifacts in the Eastern Sand region for over 10 years. Are you the one who knows more about this? Many of these ancient relics were preserved using ether particles, and they might break down if we're not careful. There are too many people in the sword tower, and it's inevitable that something might go wrong. It's safer for me to take care of them personally." With Fang Xinjian's personality, how could he take the other party's reprimand to heart? He immediately retorted, "The sword tower also has a dormitory. Why don't you just stay here? The facilities, information, and personnel here are more complete. Are they going to follow you to your house?" Seeing how Fang Xinjian was debating with the sword saint, the assistants and students were all stunned. Hop's disciple, Leon, gulped as he looked at Fang Xinjian with a hint of admiration. To dare to go against a level 29 conferred knight. He did not know if Fang Xinjian was very daring or if he was brainless. On the other side, Sasa's aura suddenly changed. He glared at Fang Xinjian and said coldly, "Are you in charge of this project or am I?" He turned to look at James and said, "Head of department, do all the students in the Great Western region teach the teachers how to research and cultivate? Don't be anxious." He turned to look at Xinjian and used his reduced force field to send a message. "Xinjian, what's going on? Why are you going against Sasa?" Fang Xinjian replied, "I also wish to study this ancient relic. Moreover, I also feel that it's safer to keep it in the sword tower." Hearing that Fang Xinjian also wished to study the dragon's scale, Sasa's eyes widened abruptly, as if killing intent was gathering in them. How could he possibly allow others to lay their hands on the secret of the dragon's scale? Putting aside the fact that Fang Xinjian was merely a genius student, even if his parents and brothers were to come, he would not allow them to lay their hands on it. This was like trying to snatch meat from Sasa's mouth. How could he possibly tolerate this? Moreover, seeing how insistent Fang Xinjian was, Sasa could not help but suspect if Fang Xinjian also knew the secret of the dragon's scale, or if he knew even more than he did. The corners of his lips curled up, and he suddenly changed his tone, saying, "Xinjian, what you say makes sense. Why don't we do it this way? You can study it with me. This ancient relic can also be kept in the sword tower. I still have some research on the ancient era. If you're interested, I can teach you." This was a retreat in order to advance. When Fang Xinjian became his subordinate, he would send him to look up the information and clean up the place. Fang Xinjian would not be able to get close to the dragon's scale. He could even think of ways to get some information from Fang Xinjian. He might even be able to get more information about the dragon's scale. James nodded, very much in favor of Fang Xinjian and Sasa building a good relationship. However, Fang Xinjian was already on his guard against Sasa. He did not wish for Sasa to find out that he could read Chinese characters and could even absorb sword intent. Therefore, he rejected firmly, "There's no need. It's better for us to study on our own." Sasa's gaze narrowed. The more it was like this, the more he felt that there was something wrong with Fang Xinjian. He tried to persuade him, "Xinjian, you haven't studied the things from the ancient era, right? The civilization from that era was completely different from the present. If there's no one to lead the way, you'll probably be wasting a lot of time." Fang Xinjian took a step back, shook his head, and said, "I think it's better for me to study it alone." He looked at head of department James and said, "I hope that I can be in charge of this ancient relic alone." In other words, he wanted to kick Sasa out. Everyone present looked at Fang Xinjian as if they were looking at a lunatic. To think that a conferred knight who had just completed his job transition wanted to kick out a level 29 conferred knight and work on his own? However, what astonished them even more was James's behavior. He did not reject Sasa right away. Instead, he frowned and seemed to be deep in thought. Fury surged in Sasa's heart as he looked at James and said, "Head of department, all right, don't quarrel." James felt a slight headache. One was an important level 29 combatant, while the other was a super genius with a bright future. He did not wish to suppress either of them. Of course, he was more inclined towards Fang Xinjian. However, if he were to suppress Sasa just like that, what would the other people in the academy think? Just then, Fang Xinjian said, "Let me be in charge of this project. I'll tell you the first 3 levels of the Pantheon Monument's profoundness in one go." James's gaze lit up. "Really?" Sasa said furiously, "Headmaster, how can you exchange benefits for something like this? Moreover, Fang Xinjian, if you want to announce it, then do it for free. To use this to threaten the academy. Do you still have any morals?" Fang Xinjian said, "I'll tell you tonight." James shook his head at Sasa and said, "The profoundness on the Pantheon Monument is very important, but the academy is not an army. We won't force the students to hand over their comprehensions. If we want others to announce everything for free, that would be collective violence. Therefore, we'll only exchange our comprehensions with the students. And Fang Xinjian doesn't need money. He only agrees to use the profoundness on the monument in exchange for our support. I feel that this is very reasonable. After I've completely deciphered all 7 levels of the profoundness, I'll also place them in the Academy's library. This will be beneficial to the advancement of the entire regional academy." With the other party standing on the school side, Sasa was unable to say anything in rebuttal. Moreover, looking at the students and teachers in the surroundings, it was impossible for him to say it in front of everyone. James tried to persuade him, "But Sasa, you're an expert in the ancient era's relics. We won't completely stop you from researching them. How about this? Both you and Fang Xinjian can take turns to come into contact with the relics for a day. Each of you will be in charge of it. How about that?" Chapter 310. Sasa gave it some thought but could not think of any other way. Moreover, in his opinion, his cultivation was much higher than Fang Xinjian's. How could Fang Xinjian possibly be able to solve the secret to the dragon's scale before him? Therefore, he nodded and said to Fang Xinjian, "Young man, you're too arrogant. The ancient era's relics aren't as simple as you think. Without a teacher's guidance, you won't be able to come up with anything. You don't have to worry about that." How could Fang Xinjian possibly give Sasa any face? He looked at the dragon's scale and said, Then let's start the first day with me? Sasa could not possibly be unable to even wait for a single day. He smiled and said, I wish you good luck. With that, he left calmly. The remaining assistants, Leon and the others all exchanged glances, looking at Fang Xinjian with strange gazes. To compete with a level 29 conferred knight. Although it was not a direct competition of battle prowess, it seemed a little too arrogant. Although Fang Xinjian had the achievements of deciphering all 7 levels of the Pantheon Monument's mysteries and clearing the Killing Techniques Palace within a day, both of these things were more dependent on one's talent, and in order to decipher the ancient relics, one would need even more power and accumulation. Sasa's ether synchronization rate of 100% made his ability to receive information and investigate the ancient era's relics many times stronger than Fang Xinjian's. None of the people present thought highly of Fang Xinjian. Even James, who knew very well of Fang Xinjian's talent, did not think highly of him. It was because deciphering the ancient era's relics did not have much to do with talent. One would need to flip through materials to decipher the words and pictures, as well as to use heaven's perception to gather the information contained in the ancient era's relics. This research depended on accumulation and ether synchronization rate. In these two aspects, Fang Xinjian was at a disadvantage in all aspects. In the end, James still did not know why Fang Xinjian was so fixated on this ancient era's relic. He shook his head and asked, Why do you have to do this? Fang Xinjian said, I'm sorry, I have my reasons. However, although Fang Xinjian knew his own reasons, most people did not see it the same way. In less than an afternoon, the news of Fang Xinjian challenging Sasa had spread throughout the academy. In the room where the ancient era's relic was located, groups of members of the Sword Tower came over to surround Fang Xinjian. They seemed to want to know why he was so confident. Fang Xinjian ignored the gazes of the people around him and calmly read the Chinese characters carved on the dragon's scale. In the eyes of the crowd, Fang Xinjian was staring blankly at an ancient artifact. Why didn't Fang Xinjian do some research? Could it be that he knows the words on it? How is that possible? We've been looking for it for almost 5 days, but we still haven't found the corresponding characters. How could he recognize it? Is he in a daze? This lad is really arrogant. He's only 17 years old and has just completed the second transition for over a month. To think that he dares to challenge a sword saint. It's good for youngsters to suffer a little. Otherwise, people would think that the geniuses of our great western region are extremely arrogant. Fang Xinjian's results in clearing the Pantheon Monument and the Killing Techniques Palace were eye-catching. However, there were also people who were jealous of his results and the 50,000 gold that the head of department had given him. In the end, both conferred knights and knights would have to fight for resources. After all, resources were limited. Fang Xinjian had occupied the sacred land with 100 times the density, consumed a tremendous amount of ferocious beasts and cultivation materials every day, and had even received 50,000 gold from the Sword Arts Department. Therefore, there were naturally people who had received lesser resources. Even if it was not Fang Xinjian who had taken the resources, the assistants might not have taken them either. However, they knew that at the very least, the resources had been snatched away by Fang Xinjian. All right. What are you all looking at? All of you, go and do your own work. Leon let out a loud bellow like a lion, chasing away the surrounding crowd. He then walked up to Fang Xinjian and said, Hee, some people are just jealous. They don't want others to get what they can't get. Why don't they think that even without you, they'll still be able to get a good ranking in the academy? He then looked at the dragon's scale curiously and asked, Is it all right for you to study it like this? Do you need me to help you move some materials? Fang Xinjian wanted to shake his head, but at the next moment, he felt that he was being too ostentatious. Therefore, he said, Help me move some research materials from the ancient era. I'll have to trouble you. Leon said with a forthright expression, Just you wait. Leave it to me. However, after being chased away by Leon a few times, there were still groups of people who came to watch Fang Xinjian. However, Fang Xinjian was unmoved. That night, he had already finished reading the sword technique on the dragon scale and was planning on absorbing the sword intent within it. He pressed one of his palms on the dragon's scale, sensing the temperature that fluctuated between cold and hot. The changes in temperature were due to the constant changes in the frequency of the dragon's scale's waves, causing his temperature to change as well. Different wave frequencies contained different information, just like the electronic signals in modern society. Right now, what Fang Xinjian needed to do was to decipher this encrypted message and gain the dragon's scale's acknowledgement. Only then would he be able to absorb the sword intent within it. He pressed his hand on the dragon's scale and continued to use his heaven's perception to read the information within, slowly deciphering the secrets within. He felt as if his consciousness had sunk into a small river. There were countless whirlpools and ripples in the river, and only by clearly seeing the trajectory of the ripples would he be able to pierce through their weak points, allowing him to swim about in the river unscathed. Once he collided with the ripples and a new ripple was created, his consciousness would be thrown out, and he would have to start from the beginning. This was also the first time that Fang Xinjian had encountered an encryption technique that used ether particles. Therefore, he had failed many times in the beginning before he gradually started to delve deeper into the dragon's scale. Just like that, a few days passed by. Fang Xinjian and Sasa took turns to come into contact with the dragon's scale, and the number of people watching Fang Xinjian also decreased. However, the people who saw that Fang Xinjian was often in a daze were even more pessimistic about Fang Xinjian's chances. In the Sword Arts Department's Killing Techniques Palace, Holt was practicing the Thunderbolt sword technique. Norman, who had been by his side, suddenly dashed in excitedly and said, "Holt, do you know? Fang Xinjian is stirring up trouble again." Holt's brows twitched. What did he do? Norman then told Holt about what had happened, smiling and saying, "I treated a senior from the Sword Tower to a meal." According to him, Fang Xinjian has been staring at the metal sheet in a daze. He's only 17 years old and has never studied the ancient era's relics before. I think he's gone silly. Holt stopped practicing the Thunderbolt sword technique. Although there was no expression on his face, he felt a little happier. He said calmly, "It's not strange for a 17-year-old conferred knight who has transitioned for over a month to not be able to win against a sword saint. Even if he were to lose, he would still be an unrivaled genius. However, I only find it a pity that he's wasting his time on meaningless things." However, he paused for a moment before saying, "Norman, help me find out more about him. He's quite interesting." Thinking of how Fang Xinjian would be crushed and taught a lesson by a sword saint, Holt was still quite happy despite not wanting to show it. This was what it meant to gloat. This was a human instinct, and Holt was no exception. He thought to himself, talent isn't omnipotent. For example, in studying the ancient era's sword techniques, talent isn't a necessity. Norman was very familiar with Holt, so how could he not understand what Holt was thinking? He even added, "Got it? I'll go and find out more about the situation." Holt watched as Norman left excitedly inside. It's because this guy doesn't focus on martial arts that he hasn't improved for so many years. However, the hint of a smile at the corner of his lips betrayed him. Chapter 3:11. Xinjian, you're here again? How's the progress of the analysis? Have you figured out the origins of those ancient era's words? Almost there. I heard that Sword Saint Sasa has already analyzed the first 200 words. Xinjian, you'll have to work hard as well. Seeing Fang Xinjian leave with an indifferent expression, the student who had asked the question let out a cold snort and thought to himself, "He's just putting on an act." Fang Xinjian continued to head toward the room where the dragon's scale was. Along the way, there were many people who greeted him and asked him about the progress of his analysis of the ancient era's relic. He answered them casually. Leon walked over and could not help but glare at the students who walked past him. He patted Fang Xinjian's shoulder and said, "Don't take it to heart. A 17-year-old genius, a 17-year-old conferred knight. These people are very jealous and are waiting to see you make a fool of yourself." "It's fine," Leon continued. "Right now, Sasa has basically confirmed that the words on the relic do not belong to any of the known languages. He has invited a language expert to analyze the words together with him. It's said that this is a type of hieroglyphic writing. Their progress is very fast." "Is that so?" Fang Xinjian said. Leon said, "Aren't you nervous? The other party is a famous sword expert in the southeast, an expert with the title of Sword Saint. That Eastern Sand region's Sword Saint is really cheap." Leon smiled bitterly and said, "You're really ambitious." As the two of them spoke, they arrived at the room where they had visited the dragon's scale. They saw that Sasa and a few other elderly men were flipping through the materials and debating the meaning of each word while surrounded by over 10 people. They should be talking about sword intent here. They're talking about the sword intent inside. But is that really possible? A sword intent that has existed for 2,000 years? Even if it's still here, there's nothing left, right? While the few of them were debating, Fang Xinjian squeezed through the crowd and walked up to the dragon's scale. "Time's up. I'll be in charge for the rest of the day." Sasa threw an impatient glance at Fang Xinjian. However, they had already copied down all the words on the dragon's scale. Even if they were not in front of the dragon's scale, it would not affect them from analyzing the meaning. "All right, let's go." Sasa left with the experts. Some of the onlookers also left, but some stayed behind to see how Fang Xinjian would analyze it. However, Fang Xinjian said, "Everyone, have you seen enough? I don't wish to disturb you today, so please leave." Only then did the group of people leave helplessly, leaving Fang Xinjian alone to continue analyzing the waves. As his consciousness got closer and closer to the source of the ripples on the dragon scale, he could feel an extremely sharp and incisive aura stirring, as if it had just woken up from a deep slumber of thousands of years. He could feel that as the words continued to analyze the ripples on the dragon scale, he was getting closer and closer to the sword intent stored within. In a few more days, he would be able to truly come into contact with this sword intent. In another office, the head of the sword arts team and the owner of the sword tower, Hops, was looking through the experimental reports during this period of time. He ascertained that there were no problems with the general direction of all the projects and also ascertained the direction for the next few months. Next to him, Leon drank his coffee and said, "Teacher, between Fang Xinjian and Sasa, who do you think will win?" "The two of them. What do you guys think?" Hops started to test his students without even lifting his head. A silver-haired young man who looked to be in his 20s said sourly, "Fang Xinjian's talent isn't bad, but when it comes to analyzing ancient relics, it's not talent but experience. Sasa has already started to analyze the words, while Fang Xinjian, he hasn't even flipped through the materials yet. I think he'll definitely lose." Leon smiled. "Hee, junior martial brother, you're jealous." "What's there to be jealous about? I'm just speaking the truth." "Leon, do you think that he'll be able to win against Sasa?" Leon shook his head and said, "To win against Sasa, it's too difficult." "Teacher, what do you think?" Hop said calmly, "Under normal circumstances, no matter what he does, it's unlikely that Fang Xinjian will be able to win against Sasa. But the problem is, do you guys think that Fang Xinjian is an idiot?" "Of course not," Leon said. "If a person who can solve the sword techniques in the Killing Techniques Palace within a day is an idiot, then wouldn't all of us be pigs? Then since Fang Xinjian isn't an idiot and he's the one who fought for this fight, he naturally has his own confidence. Therefore, I can't tell who will win." His junior frowned and said, Could it be that Fang Xinjian is too arrogant? Hop said calmly, never think of others as too stupid. This is especially so in battle. Never place your hopes of winning on other people's mistake. Another day passed, and Sasa let out a big yawn. Although most conferred knights no longer needed to sleep, he still felt a little tired after continuously depleting a large amount of his brain power to parse words like he had been doing for the past few days. After all, parsing words was akin to making guesses, arranging all sorts of possibilities, and then continuing to eliminate the possibility of mistake. It was also thanks to the fact that Sasa was no longer like a human. His powerful level 29 abilities allowed his brain to be like a supercomputer, allowing him to store countless pieces of information in his brain and then continue to compare and guess the possibilities. Thinking of how tired he had been for the past few days, Sasa suddenly smiled in self-mockery. He felt that he had been too careful. His opponent was just a young man who had just transitioned a month ago. Was there a need for him to work so hard? But this is good as well. I'll have to suppress these geniuses. Otherwise, they'll really think that their talent is unrivaled and they'll look down on their seniors. Thinking of the progress of the parsing over the past few days and how smooth everything had been, Sasa felt as if he was sitting on the moon fishing platform. As he walked toward the room where the dragon's scale was, there were many people who greeted Sasa. Lord Sword Saint, you're here again? Good morning, Lord Sword Saint. Sasa smiled and greeted everyone along the way. His smile was like a spring breeze, closing the distance between him and the others in an instant, giving off an amiable and approachable feeling. This was also the image that Sasa had always maintained. He had an elegant demeanor and was like a spring breeze, just like a scholar who had read a lot of books. He gave off the feeling that he was very cultured. However, when he got close to the dragon's scales room, he suddenly frowned. An assistant walked up to him and greeted him. Come on, Lord Sasa. How's the research going? However, Sasa turned his head abruptly, and his gaze was extremely sharp. That assistant could not help but take a few steps back, feeling as if his body had been pierced through, and his entire body trembled. However, Sasa did not have the time to pay attention to this. He stared at the dragon's scale and Fang Xinjian in the room. He could sense a sword intent, or rather, an information flow, coming out bit by bit from the dragon's scale. It was currently exchanging information with Fang Xinjian. How is this possible? This kid has already reached this level? Chapter 312. Sasa, who had been progressing very quickly over the past few days, and had felt that everything was going smoothly, saw the scene of Fang Xinjian communicating with the dragon's scale. He felt as if a basin of cold water had been poured over his head, and he felt a chill run down his spine. He had just deduced that there was a stream of sword intent hidden in the dragon's scale, but Fang Xinjian seemed to have already made contact with it. He could imagine how much glory Fang Xinjian would receive if he were to win against him in the analysis of the ancient era's artifact. However, he could also imagine how much contempt and mockery he would receive if he were to fail after being used as a stepping stone by Fang Xinjian. This was not just a matter of his reputation. At the very least, the support the Great Western Region Regional Academy had for him would be greatly reduced. Moreover, the dragon's scale was the secret of being unrivaled in the world. How could he possibly allow others to lay their hands on it? This was what Sasa could not tolerate the most. It was only then that he thought of a problem that he had never considered before. What would be the outcome if he were to lose to Fang Xinjian? The secret of the dragon's scale. Even if it's not really unrivaled in the world, as it can allow the heavenly lord of the blood sea to attain a breakthrough to the divine level, I must not let Fang Xinjian snatch it away. Sasa's gaze sharpened as he thought of this outcome. This can't go on in an instant. He returned to his original appearance, as if he had not discovered anything. He smiled and walked up to Fang Xinjian. Your progress isn't bad. you've solved the secret of the artifact? Not yet. Fang Xinjian's brows furrowed, and he helplessly stopped his communication with the sword intent. Although he had come into contact with the sword intent, he discovered that this sword intent, or rather, the information remnant left behind by a certain person, was like the information remnant in the level 29 superior grade set, the Heavenly Abyss Annihilation Armor. It already had a simple consciousness. He wanted to absorb this sword intent according to the method recorded in the dragon's scale, but he realized that the other party ignored him and was not willing to be absorbed by him. He tried to communicate with it for an entire night. Just as he was showing some signs of improvement, he was interrupted by Sasa. Moreover, with Sasa's arrival, the sword intent had completely retracted back into the dragon's scale and could no longer be sensed. Hating Sasa's interruptions, Fang Xinjian stood up. He could not be bothered with Sasa and walked out with big stride. During this period of time, other than analyzing the dragon's scale, he also wanted to cultivate his sword art. However, Sasa stopped him and said with some enthusiasm, "Xinjian, do you want to have a discussion with us? You might not be able to come up with a comprehensive plan by yourself. I've specially invited a few experts from the Eastern Sand region to come over. Do you want to exchange your views with us?" Fang Xinjian turned and threw him a glance. Fang Xinjian. Fang Xinjian. Displeased Fang Xinjian looking to look Fang. However, Fang Xinjian only said calmly, "Not interested." With that, he turned and left. This lad. Sasa's face twitched. As a famous swordsman in the southeast, when had he ever been treated so rudely? Even someone like the governor would treat him with respect. Otherwise, he would be said to be arrogant and conceited. I can't just let this go. Many schemes kept on flashing in Sasa's mind. As a level 29 conferred knight who had killed his way through the battlefield, Sasa had never been a good person in the traditional sense of the word. On the battlefield, he had killed countless enemies. It was because those who only knew how to attack head-on and fight fiercely would not be able to survive to the very end. Oh right. His rebirth sword technique must have caused a lot of controversy recently. Sasa's eyes narrowed slightly. He walked out the door, saw an assistant, and said, "Fang Xinjian's rebirth sword technique. The sword tower has it, right? Bring it over and let me take a look." He started to laugh coldly in his heart. If this sword technique of yours is really filled with all sorts of poisons, then forget it. But if I were to find even the slightest flaw, then don't blame me for being ruthless. In his opinion, it was impossible for a self-created sword technique like Fang Xinjian, a 17-year-old genius, to be flawless. I can think of other ways to deal with it. At Sasa's position, the resources in society were too abundant. He had too many cards in his hands to deal with a student from a regional academy, even if the student was a great genius. However, Fang Xinjian did not know what was going on. He continued to work hard on his sword arts daily and communicate with the sword intent hidden in the dragon's scale. However, that sword intent was like a disobedient child who had just opened his eyes to see the world. It kept flashing and appearing, hiding whenever there were any slight changes. This made it impossible for Fang Xinjian to communicate with it properly, let alone absorb it. Even when he tried to absorb it according to the method inscribed on the dragon's scale, the sword intent remained unmoved, unwilling to enter Fang Xinjian's body even after a long time. On this day, Fang Xinjian once again arrived at the sword tower. However, he was stopped by a man who was hiding in a cloak. The man handed him a stack of documents and said calmly, "If you want to resolve this matter, come and look for me at the mountain behind the academy at this time tomorrow." With that, the man left. Fang Xinjian frowned and opened the document on the spot. There were only about 5 pages in the document, and most of them were names and data. However, the content was a little shocking. It recorded the situation of a sword arts dojo. 3 of their students had practiced a type of sword technique, and within a short period of 1 week, all of them had suffered from varying degrees of internal injuries. Although it was not directly stated that the injuries were caused by this sword technique, the comparison of the data was too obvious. Even if it was Fang Xinjian, after seeing this set of data, would feel that the internal injuries on their bodies were caused by practicing the new sword technique. Moreover, the name of this sword technique was the rebirth sword technique. Looking at the document in his hands, Fang Xinjian's heart sank. The sample size of 3 students was too small. However, all 3 of them had suffered from internal injuries, and the situation was too serious. My rebirth sword technique is definitely perfect. Why would there be internal injuries? Suddenly, Sasa walked over, smiled and said, "What's wrong, Xinjian? Are you in a bad mood?" Fang Xinjian threw a cold glance at Sasa, then put the document away and left. After Fang Xinjian left, Sasa's countenance sank. He looked at Fang Xinjian's back as if he was looking at a dead man. "You can continue to be arrogant while you still have the time. I'm looking forward to seeing how the association will deal with you after they find out about the problem with the rebirth sword technique." Thinking of this, the corners of Sasa's lips curled up slightly, and he left in a good mood. "Lord Sasa? You seem to be in a good mood. Is the analysis going well?" "Haha, it's going well. It shouldn't be long before it's solved." Chapter 313. Walking up to the dragon's scale, Fang Xinjian let out a breath, as if all his worries and troubles had been exhaled from his mouth. Although the document earlier had made him feel that it was troublesome, it was useless to think about these things now. On the other hand, the matter regarding the dragon's scale was also very important. It was better for him to compete with Sasa every day. If he were to waste this time, it would only create new troubles on top of that document. Therefore, Fang Xinjian forcefully put aside the matter regarding the document and once again focused all of his consciousness on the dragon's scale. With the help of his heaven's perception, his consciousness leaned toward the dragon's scale. Perhaps it was because of the document, or perhaps it was because of the instinct in his mind. This was because Fang Xinjian's consciousness did not carry the information in the Empire's language. Instead, it was from Earth, from Xian country, from the instinctive language in his body, Chinese characters. A person's mother tongue was usually the language that the person's brain instinctively used to think. Today, Fang Xinjian had subconsciously used his heaven's perception to send the information over in the form of Chinese characters. Then something unexpected happened. Amidst Fang Xinjian's astonishment, the heaven's volition's sword intent, which had been avoiding him and unwilling to pay any attention to him, was now like a curious baby, slowly extending out from the dragon's scale. Fang Xinjian could sense waves of ripples sweeping through his body, as if wanting to communicate with him. Fang Xinjian hesitated for a moment before sending another message. "You can understand Chinese?" Sword intent was formless and immaterial. However, at this moment, Fang Xinjian seemed to have felt the sword intent tremble a little, and a joyful message was sent over. Sword intent is ultimately a cultivator's information remnant. It's also a type of information flow. However, it's different from the heavenly abyss annihilation armor. What's condensed in it is the cultivator's spirit, will, and understanding toward sword arts. If the information remnant in the heavenly abyss annihilation armor is the cultivator's memories and emotions, then the information remnant in the dragon's scale is pure emotions. And in the long wait, this emotion gradually gained some intelligence. When it heard Chinese, it had a reaction that seemed like it was happy. Is it because he was born from the emotions of a certain martial artist, so he relies on instinct to act? In that case, aren't they similar to animals like kittens and puppies? Therefore, after that, Fang Xinjian kept sending Chinese characters into the interior of the dragon's scale. He could feel the sword intent in it surging increasingly. It was as if he had just woken up, but the continuous stream of Chinese characters made him more and more awake. As the Chinese characters continued to spread, Fang Xinjian could also sense that the sword intent was no longer as wary of him as it was in the past. Instead, it was gradually getting familiar with him. Fang Xinjian could now feel the waves of the sword intent hitting his body. It was as if the other party was using its tentacles to study him. Very cautious. But in the end, it doesn't have true intelligence. You like Chinese characters, so you can become familiar with me. What else would you like? Fang Xinjian's eyes lit up and he suddenly understood. Since it was sword intent, it was naturally interested in sword theory. Fang Xinjian gave it some thought and sent the information related to the new nine-headed dragon sword technique in his mind over in Chinese. The sword intent in the dragon's scale seemed to fall silent for a moment. Then at the next moment, a gush of ecstasy gushed forth. It was a tremendous amount of information flow, but it was only filled with the information of happiness. It was as if countless words of ecstasy had been copied and sent over to Fang Xinjian's brain. The information flow gushed toward Fang Xinjian's brain and consciousness. However, the moment it got close, the heavenly abyss annihilation armor reacted. Romalov's martial will soared up abruptly, gushing forth like a sandstorm, clashing against the sword intense information flow. However, when the heavenly abyss annihilation armor, which could easily crush low-level conferred knights, and Damirov's martial will, which could suppress Fang Xinjian, encountered the sword intense information flow, it was like tofu bumping into a kitchen knife. It was easily sliced into countless pieces, allowing the sword intense information flow to gush into Fang Xinjian's brain. What? Before he could react, the information flow had already gushed into his brain. Fang Xinjian held onto his head, feeling as if his brain was overloaded. He retreated over 10 steps before coming to a stop. He lifted his head and looked at the dragon's scale, feeling for the first time how terrifying the sword intent in the dragon's scale was. Who on earth left this sword intent behind? The heavenly abyss annihilation armor's martial will is already the remnant information of a level 29 expert. Moreover, it's the remnant information of a level 29 expert's corpse. This sword intent is a stream of sword intent left behind by my master. To think that a casual information flow attack is able to slash through the heavenly abyss annihilation armor's full defense. Then how powerful must the person who left behind this sword intent be? Divine level? Or perhaps even stronger? Fang Xinjian looked at the dragon's scale, and after a series of thoughts, his gaze became even more fervent. Such a powerful sword intent. If he could get his hands on the sword intent and the power within it, how much would his abilities increase? After giving it some thought, Fang Xinjian rubbed his aching head and once again walked toward the dragon's scale, probing it with his consciousness. The probing earlier had made him understand that the Heaven's Volition sword intent was very fond of sword arts. Therefore, if he were to think of a way to give it some benefits, he would still be able to use sword arts to lure it out. Therefore, a thought flashed through Fang Xinjian's mind. He sent over 1/10 of the lightless sword's contents that he had just learned. Once again there was great joy. However, this time around, Fang Xinjian was prepared. Although his head was still in great pain, he treated it as training his martial will and martial spirit. Sensing the hunger coming from the dragon's scale, Fang Xinjian started to transmit information and ask questions. Come into my body. As long as you come into my body, I'll send you the rest of the sword technique's contents. In the dragon's scale, Fang Xinjian could sense the sword intent's struggle, hesitation, and hunger. This sword intent had already developed some intelligence. Although it could not speak or write, it could allow people to sense the basic changes in its emotions, just like animals like cats and dogs. Fang Xinjian tried sending some sword techniques over, but they could only make the sword intent hesitate. They were unable to make it come out and enter his body. Just like that, in the end, Fang Xinjian sent over the first 2,000 words of the rebirth sword technique. This set of sword technique was created by combining 100 sets of nurturing sword technique. It's a perfect sword technique for nurturing sword technique. It was just a simple 2,000 words, but the sword intent was already cheering excitedly. It was as if it was on drugs, and even the entire dragon's scale seemed to be trembling. Fang Xinjian stared at the dragon's scale. "Do you want this set of sword technique? If you do, then come over to me. After seeing this set of sword technique, you should be able to understand my talent. With my talent in sword arts, I'll be able to create many sword techniques like this in the future. No, it'll be many sword techniques that are even stronger than this. If you want it, then come over to me." In that instant, the entire dragon's scale trembled violently, and the sword intent seemed to be struggling to an extreme. Right now, in its eyes, Fang Xinjian was like a piece of fresh, tender, and juicy meat. Therefore, under Fang Xinjian's excited gaze, he could sense that there was something invisible and intangible in the dragon's scale, yet it truly existed. It was coming out bit by bit. Chapter 3:14. Just as the Heaven's Volition sword intent in the dragon's scale was stirring, as if it would leap into Fang Xinjian's embrace at any moment, a cough rang out behind Fang Xinjian. The Heaven's Volition sword intent retracted abruptly and returned to the dragon's scale, disappearing without a trace. A wave of fury rose in Fang Xinjian's heart. He stood up abruptly and looked behind him. He saw Sasa standing there apologetically, saying, "I'm sorry, Xinjian. I saw that it was about time and came over. Did I disturb you?" Killing intent seemed to be gathering on Fang Xinjian's face. Anyone who had encountered the situation earlier, being disturbed just as the Heaven's Volition sword intent was about to enter their body, causing all their efforts to go to waste, would probably be so infuriated that they would want to kill someone. This was especially so as he had finally managed to lure the sword intent out after much difficulty. He did not know if he would be able to succeed the next time around. This made the killing intent in Fang Xinjian's heart even more intense. However, he knew that he was currently not a match for Sasa, a level 29 conferred knight. Therefore, he did not really make a move. He merely threw a cold glance at Sasa, remembered what had happened, and then left. However, in Sasa's eyes, his actions were already very disrespectful. Humph, Fang Xinjian, you won't have the time to mess around with my dragon's scale anymore." Thinking of the secret in the dragon's scale, Sasa could not help but feel a strong desire. The secret hidden in the dragon's scale might not be invincible, but it was also related to attaining the divine level. Sasa was determined to get his hands on such an important item, and he would not allow anyone else to get their hands on it. "I must get my hands on the secret to the dragon's scale before Fang Xinjian does." As for whether he would destroy the dragon's scale, kill all the researchers, or do something else, it would all depend on what secret Sasa had gotten his hands on. However, it was no longer just about being the first. Seeing how confident Fang Xinjian was, in order to monopolize the secret, Fang Xinjian was determined to stop him from continuing. Fang Xinjian was infuriated, and he quickened his pace. He dashed out like a sharp sword, leaving behind many deep sword marks on the ground of the sword tower. However, with the mental cultivation method running, his brain still maintained a basic level of calmness. Thinking about the documents he had obtained, he rushed to the agreed place. Like a gust of wind, Fang Xinjian arrived at the small path at the back of the mountain and saw a man in black standing there. It was the man who had given him the documents yesterday. Seeing Fang Xinjian's arrival, the man said, "You're here. How is it? Did you break out in a cold sweat after seeing this data report?" To think that there would be such a huge flaw in the nurturing technique that he had put in so much effort to create. Fang Xinjian said coldly, "Who are you? What do you want?" "I want you to go to the Sand Country and help me search for something." The man sneered and said, "If you don't agree, this data report will appear on the Knight Association's report." The Knight's Handbook was published by the Knight Association. Naturally, the Knight Association would be responsible for any problems with the sword techniques published in the handbook. Throughout history, there had been many cases of people plagiarizing and faking their martial techniques, and those conferred knights had all ended up in a miserable state. The Knight Association managed over 100,000 knights and conferred knights across the entire empire. How much authority did they have? In order to protect their prestige, and authority, the moment they were discovered to be faking or plagiarizing, they would be dealt with very badly. First of all, their knight qualifications would be revoked, and then they would be fined heavily. Even their powers would be crippled to varying degrees depending on how serious the situation was. If it was more serious, they would be charged with treason. Of course, even the simplest warning would probably cause the knight to no longer be able to get any cultivation resources, and they would no longer be able to find a way out in the empire. Any academy or influence would reject the entry of such a knight. Therefore, the black-clothed man's threat was very serious, even serious. However, Fang Xinjian let out a cold laugh and said, "It's impossible for there to be any problems with my rebirth sword technique. For the 3 students in this dojo to suffer from internal injuries, there must be some other interfering factor. Therefore, I won't accept your threat." Fang Xinjian had the world's top sword arts talent, so how could he not be confident in his own sword arts? It was because he understood his own sword arts too well and understood each and every movement of the rebirth sword technique. This was why he knew that there would not be any problems with the rebirth sword technique. The rebirth sword technique was formed by refining the essence of 100 sets of nurturing sword technique. Which of those 100 sets of nurturing sword techniques had not been tempered and tempered? The problem could only be with the cultivator, and not with the rebirth sword technique. This was Fang Xinjian's own confidence in his sword arts, as well as his judgment based on his high level of sword arts. It was because of this that he would not panic the moment he received the news, which might even affect his analysis of the sword intent or cause him to be flustered when the other party made a request. With a casual move, a stone sword darted out from the ground and was held in his hand. With the reinforcement from the swordless path, it became a level 19 inferior divine weapon. Fang Xinjian said calmly, "I'm not interested in your threat. The reason why I'm here is to see who on earth dares to threaten me. The thing I hate the most in my life is people threatening me." As he spoke, Fang Xinjian's body moved. There seemed to be a stream of electricity piercing through the air, and a sword light appeared on the black-clothed man's neck. Fang Xinjian said calmly, "Now let me see who on earth you are." The ether sword ripples swept through the man's cloak, and the black cloak was instantly torn into pieces. However, what was revealed was not a real person, but a native. The native opened his mouth and said with a smile, "Fang Xinjian, we've long known that you're arrogant and unreasonable. You'll make a move at the slightest disagreement. How could I possibly rush over to tangle with you?" At the next moment, the native said coldly, "Leave the academy within 3 days and head to the Sand Country to await further instructions. Otherwise, you can wait for the association's investigation." After saying this, the native disintegrated in that instant, turning into fine sand on the ground. Fang Xinjian looked at the fine sand on the ground and started to ponder. Sand Country? They want my heavenly abyss annihilation armor? Someone from the Sand Country? The only people that Fang Xinjian could think of who would do this seemed to be the people from the Sand Country. They wanted to lure him to the Sand Country and get the heavenly abyss annihilation armor. No matter what, it was a divine weapon forged from the remains of their national hero. 3 days. At the thought of this, Fang Xinjian turned to leave. Of course, it was impossible for him to head to the Sand Country. From here to the Sand Country and back, it would take at least a month's time. How could he possibly waste his time on this? Moreover, he did not need to handle this alone. In the head of department's office. What? Someone has suffered from internal injuries after cultivating your rebirth sword technique? Is it because of internal organ failure? Fang Xinjian sent the set of data to James, the head of department, and said, "It can't be a problem with the sword technique. There could only be other factors that have interfered. But if we really get them to submit this to the association and let them come over to investigate, it'll be troublesome." "It's not just troublesome." James frowned and said, "Those bureaucrats can create trouble for no reason at all. Even if it's proven that there's no problem with us, you and I, or even the entire academy might be skinned alive. You don't have to bother about this. I'll get someone to handle it. Let's think of a way to shut up this dojo first. Then things will be easier." Chapter 3:15. 2 days later, Fang Xinjian smiled as he looked at the dragon's scale. He could sense an extremely sharp and majestic aura sweeping to and fro in his body, exuding waves of curiosity. After another day of temptation, Fang Xinjian handed over half of the rebirth sword technique and finally let the Heaven's Volition sword intent continue to circulate in his body. Although the Heaven's Volition sword intent was still unwilling to be subdued, it was still a great improvement. Fang Xinjian could sense an extremely strong desire to engulf and avarice deep within the Heaven's Volition sword intent. He believed that as long as he continued to use sword techniques to tempt the Heaven's Volition sword intent, he would eventually be able to subdue it and learn the Heaven's Volition sword technique. Just then, the sound of the door being pushed open rang out again. The Heaven's Volition sword intent seemed to be startled and retracted bit by bit. However, this time around, Fang Xinjian could sense that it was reluctant to part with the sword technique in his body. It did not leave so decisively like the first time. Fang Xinjian smiled and allowed the Heaven's Volition sword intent to leave. He turned and saw Sword Saint Sasa walking in. Sasa greeted him as usual. "How is it, Xinjian? Is everything going well? We've already deciphered 50% of the text. Everyone is very motivated." Fang Xinjian shook his head and said nonchalantly, "Is that so? Then you guys might have to waste time. I'll be able to complete this sword technique in at most half a month's time." Sasa's eyes narrowed as he watched coldly as Fang Xinjian left. Seeing how confident Fang Xinjian was, Sasa also felt a sense of urgency. How could he, who was determined to get his hands on the dragon's scale, allow Fang Xinjian to be one step ahead of him? "I must hurry up. I mustn't let the secret of the dragon's scale fall into the hands of others. I must stop Fang Xinjian from delving deeper." Following that, the experts who were working together with Sasa to analyze the ancient characters walked in while yawning. Most of them were just ordinary knights. Some of them were even commoners. After staying up all night, they were very tired. It was impossible for them to be as spirited as Sasa. He didn't even feel tired at all. Sasa looked at them and said, "What about Jellos and Benjamin? Why aren't they here?" "They're sick. They've been staying up late for the past few days. They're already in their 60s, and their bodies can't keep up. I have to come even if I can't keep up." Sasa coldly said, "This month's salary will be doubled. From now on, all of you will cancel your rest. In half a month, no, within a week, you must finish analyzing all the ancient language." In an instant, a series of sorrowful cries rang out. One of the experts said, "You're a conferred knight, and you won't have a problem staying up for so long. But for us, there's no way we'll be able to persevere, and it'll even affect our efficiency. Furthermore, you're asking us to explain in sections, so we can't analyze it according to the context. That's why the result is so slow. You should ask us to combine all the sections together." Sasa nodded reluctantly. Time was of the essence. Moreover, after analyzing it for so long, he was basically certain that the secret of the dragon's scale was hidden in the sword intent. Even if the people outside knew about the full text, they would not know the secret. Therefore, he said, "Then let's combine the upper text and analyze it together. The results must be out within 3 days." After giving it some thought, he seemed to realize that his demands were really too high. He slowed down and said, "I'll get someone to invite more people over. You guys just need to hang on for this period of time. As long as you guys are able to finish analyzing the dragon scale, I'll guarantee the conditions I promised you guys earlier. I'll also add on a reward of 1,000 gold per person." Hearing this news, everyone present cheered a little. A reward of 1,000 gold was already a huge sum of money. Even Sasa himself felt a little heartache. However, as long as they were able to analyze the full text first, this was an investment that could be tolerated. "Fang Xinjian, this won't do, Xinjian." James shook his head and said, "When we went to investigate, we discovered that the teacher and the 3 students were no longer around. Someone had hidden them. It seems that they're determined to do this. We must be prepared for the worst." Fang Xinjian's brows furrowed deeply. His time was tight, and what he hated the most right now was to spend his time on these messy things. He asked, if they were to report this matter to the association, what would happen? The association keeps a very tight watch on each set of martial techniques that are included in the Knight's Handbook. It's because each set of sword technique might be cultivated by thousands or even tens of thousands of knights, and hundreds of thousands or even millions of apprentices. As the saying goes, it's better to kill 1,000 innocents than to let one go. Your rebirth sword technique has also been evaluated by me and the others. It was only after we ascertained that there were no problems that it was included in the Knight's Handbook. Now that a problem has arisen, we're not the only ones affected. They're also in a very passive position. Therefore, the association will act very quickly. They'll first make an announcement to stop all cultivation and experimentation of the rebirth sword technique. Next, they'll ask you to hand over all the relevant information and they'll conduct questioning and arbitration. If you're unable to prove that there are no problems with the sword technique during the arbitration, the Knight Association will then form a team of experts to conduct a new round of experimentation and evaluation on the entire set of sword technique. If they're unable to ascertain it, they might send out apprentices with different conditions to go through 1, 2, or even 3 rounds of experimental training until they're completely sure that there are no problems. James frowned and sighed. If that's the case, it might take a few years before you can prove your innocence. Even if it's proven in the end, the negative effects it will bring will be irreversible. In the end, there might not even be anyone who would dare to cultivate your rebirth sword technique. Fang Xinjian said, "We can't allow them to continue experimenting and examining it without any restrictions. We must prove that there are no problems with the rebirth sword technique during the arbitration. The most direct and trustworthy way to prove it would naturally be to get a large number of people to cultivate the rebirth sword technique. However, this would take up too much time and resources. It could be said that it was very rare for any sword technique to be proven in such a way. Then for many people who were not sword arts experts, how were they to judge the quality of a sword technique? Naturally, they would have to ask a real expert. It was just like the Knight Association's arbitration. On one hand, it would depend on the materials that Fang Xinjian had prepared. On the other hand, it would depend on whether Fang Xinjian was able to get a sufficiently influential character to testify for him. Sword arts had always been difficult to understand. Most ordinary people did not understand profound sword theories. When they were unable to rely on their own brains to make a judgment, the only thing they could do was to listen to the suggestions of experts. The stronger an expert was, the greater their reputation would be, and the more people would listen to their words. I'll send people to continue looking for those 3 students, but we'll have to make sufficient preparations as well. James thought of the scandal of a conferred knight from the Great Western region creating a sword technique which resulted in his students suffering from internal injuries. Don't worry, I'll look for a few heavyweight old friends. Even if you go to the arbitration, you won't be at a disadvantage. Chapter 3:16. With regards to what James had said, it was impossible for Fang Xinjian to do nothing. Arriving at the entrance of the sacred land, Fang Xinjian looked at Zhou Xingwen, who was waiting there, and then walked up. In terms of connections, Fang Xinjian was a far cry from someone like James, who was the headmaster of the regional academy 2 generations ago. However, this did not mean that he had no connections at all. Handing the 3 letters to Zhou Xingwen, Fang Xinjian said calmly, "Help me send these 3 letters out. Remember, you must definitely send them to them." Zhou Xingwen looked at the letters. The first one was from the Northern Ice Region's Regional Academy's Rellings. He asked, "You know this guy?" It's said that his abilities have already surpassed that of the Northern Ice Region's governor. Fang Xinjian did not say anything. To be honest, if Rellings had not sent someone over to invite him to the Northern Ice Region for an exchange a few days ago, he would not have gotten to know this person. Moreover, this letter was a desperate attempt. He was not sure if Rellings would be willing to testify for him regarding the rebirth sword technique during the arbitration. Zhou Xingwen looked at the second envelope. It was addressed to the current Regional Academy's headmaster, the Great Western Region's Governor Devitt. He knew that Devitt admired and supported Fang Xinjian a lot. However, he did not know that Fang Xinjian was actually trying to contact the second prince. Even if he had absolute confidence in the rebirth sword technique, it would be too foolish if he were to take it on by himself and wait for something to happen before asking for help from others. As the saying went, even a ferocious tiger would have to use its full power to capture a rabbit. Of course, Fang Xingwen had to make good use of his time and mobilize all the powers he could. It would be even better if the governor and the second prince could testify for him. When Zhou Xingwen saw the third letter, his eyes almost popped out as he said in astonishment, "You're going to send it to this lord?" I'll give it a try." Fang Xinjian's third letter was sent to the Holy Orison. This divine-level expert had once wanted to take Fang Xinjian in as his disciple. If the Holy Orison really had an eye for talent, he might help Fang Xinjian. Moreover, Fang Xinjian had added a little sweetness to the contents of the letter. He didn't know if someone like Holy Orison would be satisfied, but it was meaningful to give it a try. After all, once a god-level figure like Holy Orison spoke, the arbitration would basically win. Who would dare to refute Holy Orison's theory? What if the Holy Orison proved that there was no problem with the rebirth sword technique? Who would dare to say that there was something wrong with this sword technique? After sending these 3 letters, Fang Xinjian walked towards the sword gauntlet, intending to continue with today's research. Regardless of how the association's arbitration would turn out, he had done all the necessary preparations. At the end of the day, it was all so that he wouldn't waste time and affect his own cultivation. If he were to continue to be unable to let it go, or even affect his cultivation and progress because of this matter, wouldn't he be putting the cart before the horse? When Fang Xinjian arrived at the sword gauntlet, he noticed that the gazes of the people around him were all a little strange. They seemed to be filled with pity and disdain, and there were even people who were gloating. They then pointed at Fang Xinjian and said something to the people next to them. Leon walked over with a gloomy countenance. When he saw Fang Xinjian, he merely said coldly, "Xinjian, come over here first. Teacher Hops is looking for you." This morning, the Sword Arts Department had received a notice from the Knight Association, raising the issue of the internal injuries caused by the rebirth sword technique and requesting for the department to conduct an internal investigation. Hops, who was the one who had approved the matter, had received a stern warning. As Hops' disciple, Leon was naturally embarrassed as well. And the reason for all this was because of Fang Xinjian. Right now, Leon was obviously not in a good mood toward Fang Xinjian. Arriving at the office, Hops lifted his head to look at Fang Xinjian, smiled, and said, "You're here, Xinjian." He handed the association's notice to Fang Xinjian and asked, "What are your thoughts on this?" "It's just a waste of my time. There's definitely no problem with the rebirth sword technique," Leon said angrily. If there's no problem with the rebirth sword technique, why did those 3 brats suffer from internal injuries? It's impossible for normal nurturing sword techniques to suffer from sports injuries. Moreover, do you know? The latest news from the central government was obtained from a classmate of mine who went there. Someone from the central government has already found them. They're not suffering from ordinary internal injuries. All 3 of their internal organs have deteriorated and they're completely crippled. If they exert any strength, they'll bleed internally, and it's impossible for them to continue with their martial arts. If this continues on, their lives will be in danger. The 3 of them had cultivated the rebirth sword technique at the same time, and their internal organs had deteriorated at the same time. Furthermore, they had all been crippled, and the situation was even more serious than before. If it had only been the rebirth sword technique that had a problem, then with such an outcome, the arbitration would definitely receive more attention. Oh. We couldn't find them when we looked for them, but the association just casually looked for them? That's even more of a problem for them. Fang Xinjian did not give in at all. It should be said that from now on until the end of the arbitration, he would not give in at all. It was because once he showed the slightest sign of weakness, or even admitted that there might be some unknown problems with the rebirth sword technique, no one would forgive him. He would only end up in a situation of no return. Moreover, he had absolute confidence in the rebirth sword technique. To him, the other party's actions were just like that of a clown. Hops stopped Leon and said, "In terms of sword theories, there's no problem with the rebirth sword technique. This isn't my focus to begin with, but since the association is looking for trouble for no reason, I can't possibly watch as the people from our academy get bullied." Saying this, he let out a cold snort. Those people from the Night Association don't seek to improve themselves and are bureaucratic. To think that they've even set their sights on our great Western region. But now that the consequences are so serious and might even be life-threatening, you'll have to be even more careful during the arbitration. But don't worry, Xinjian. I've already started cultivating the rebirth sword technique. If it's an arbitration, I'll be your witness. The reason why I've called you over today is so that you can focus on your cultivation and research. Don't be affected by the outside world. I know that there are some people in the academy who are jealous of those with talent. Don't take them to heart. Leon frowned and said, "Teacher, what if something happens to you after you cultivate the rebirth sword technique?" Hops glared at Leon and said, "How many times have I taught you? When cultivating sword arts and researching martial techniques, the most important thing is that you mustn't echo what others say. You must believe in your own cultivation, believe in your sword theories, and believe in your own judgment. You mustn't always follow behind others." He then waved his hand and said, "Xinjian, you can go. Focus on your cultivation and don't get distracted." "Teacher Hops, thank you." Fang Xinjian then suddenly asked, "Teacher, do you know of a martial technique that can allow one to create clones of Earth?" "Why did you suddenly think of asking this?" Hops gave it some thought and said, "The 90,000 godly demon flash that you've learned is already a top-notch killing technique for clones. As for the other clones, most of them were forcefully formed by manipulating matter. It's not an ordinary form. It's one that can move independently or from a distance. It can even speak." Hop's brows twitched as he said, "This type of martial technique is very rare. I heard that the Sand Country specializes in controlling soil. The southeastern region, which has been at war with them for a long period of time, is also quite proficient in this." "Thank you, teacher. I'll be leaving first." "As expected, it's the Sand Country?" Fang Xinjian stared at everyone's various gazes as he arrived at the research room of the Dragon's Scale. Before he even got close, he could already hear snoring sound. After Fang Xinjian left, Hops suddenly let out a sigh. Leon asked, "Master, what's wrong?" Hops said, "You're still unconvinced? That's because you've only seen the surface of this matter." "Surface?" Chapter 317. Is there really a need to prove whether the rebirth sword technique is harmful or not? Hops shook his head. This is just an excuse. Since someone has pushed for the first step, there will naturally be someone who will push for the subsequent event. Do you know? This is the first time I've seen the rebirth sword technique. What I saw was not only excitement but also fear. If the rebirth sword technique is real, then with a 10 times increase in potential, how much would all the knights, conferred knights, and knight apprentices receive? If it's real, then what about the nurturing sword techniques of the other factions? What would the factions do? Give up on their nurturing sword techniques? Then would they still have apprentices? Not give up? Then would their apprentices be surpassed by the empire? And what would the government think when faced with the people of the middle and lower levels, as well as the knights and knight apprentices who are about to receive a great leap in their abilities? Do they really hope for the factions to grasp this sword technique as well? Had the Church of Universal Truth also grasped this sword technique? Do they really hope for their subordinates to improve by leaps and bounds, for the apprentices who are not part of the system to improve as well? By the time Hops said this, Leon's back was already drenched in sweat. You're saying that this time around, we're going up against. Hops merely stood up and looked at the people outside, saying, 500 years ago, in order to forbid commoners from cultivating martial arts, the Uzbekistan Empire even spread the theory that cultivating martial arts would lead to premature aging. 200 years ago, in order to develop tobacco, the Northern Trade Association spread the fallacy that tobacco could increase one's attribute. The right to speak in this world has always been controlled by the strong, unless there's an even stronger person who can break their restrictions. But since that's the case, why would the association publish the rebirth sword technique in the Knight's Handbook? Hops laughed out loud. It's because they don't believe it. They know how amazing the rebirth sword technique is, but they don't believe that it has 10 times the efficiency and 5,000 potential points. Who would believe that? And the fact that it has reached such a level means that there's already someone in the Central who has mastered the rebirth sword technique. But teacher, why are you doing this? If His Majesty and the other factions' sect leaders aren't prepared to accept the rebirth sword technique, then they should accept it, Hops said calmly. I only hope that the Empire's new generation can cultivate the most outstanding sword techniques. I hope that all the powerful martial skills can be popularized and not be in the hands of a small group of people. I wish that when I started practicing sword arts at the age of 5, I would have been able to practice such a sword art. Does Xinjiang know? He doesn't need to know. On the other side, Fang Xinjiang opened the door to the research lab and walked in. He saw that most of Sasa's subordinates had already fallen asleep. They were too tired and only slept for 1 or 2 hours every day. Working around the clock to help Sasa analyze the ancient characters had overloaded their brains, and their energy had been depleted. Sasa saw Fang Xinjiang coming in and forced a smile. You're here? Then we're leaving. You can continue. When Sasa passed by Fang Xinjiang, he heard Fang Xinjiang say softly, If I tell you the secret of the dragon's scale, will you stop? Sasa's footsteps paused, and at the next moment, he asked puzzledly, What secret? What do you mean by stopping? Fang Xinjiang smiled and said, It's nothing. Speaking of which, my research has also reached a bottleneck. I reckon that in the end, you'll still be the one to successfully analyze the dragon's scale. Sasa led his subordinates out of the research lab. As he walked along the corridor, his gaze suddenly narrowed. This guy is already suspecting me? But it's useless now. I've only pushed forward the first step. Even if I wanted to stop now, I can't. The problem with the rebirth sword technique? His greatest problem is that he's too outstanding. Things that are 10 years ahead will be sought after, but things that are 100 years ahead will only be suppressed by the current influences. They won't allow this power to be grasped by apprentices and factions. As for factions, If apprentices are the foundation, then the rebirth sword technique is digging up their root. In the research lab, Fang Xijian watched as Sasa left slowly and thought coldly to himself, could it be him? Fang Xijian had thought that the person who had threatened him was someone from the Sand Country, and that their target was the Heavenly Abyss annihilation armor he was wearing. However, when he saw Sasa, he suddenly recalled that Sasa had been staying at the borders of the Sand Country all year round, fighting against the Sand Country's experts. Although it was impossible for Fang Xijian to see through a person's heart, a level 21 conferred knight would be able to see a person's brainwaves and emotions. If one did not know the inside story, they would definitely not understand what Fang Xijian meant when he said that he wanted to keep the secret and stop. Fang Xijian had not even told the governor and Hops about the matter of threatening to go to the Sand Country. He had only told them about his internal injuries. When Fang Xijian said this, he had clearly seen ecstasy, greed, and nervousness from Sasa. Although these emotions had disappeared completely in the blink of an eye, and Sasa had also replied that he did not know, Fang Xijian suddenly realized that Sasa was also very suspicious of him being the mastermind behind this. To think that he would go to such an extent for the sake of an ancient era's sword technique. But he's disguised himself as someone from the Sand Country. Even if I suspect that it's him, there's no way for me to prove it. Moreover, I'm only suspecting it. It might not be him. Fang Xijian could tell that even with Sasa's status as a level 29 expert, he would definitely have to pay a great price to push and accelerate these things. Moreover, by doing this, he would at most be able to stop Fang Xijian, but it would not be of any help to his own research. Interesting. Could it be that the Heaven's Volition sword intent still has some secrets that I don't know about? After all, Fang Xijian was not a native of the Empire. He had not expected how great of an impact the rebirth sword intent would have on the entire Empire. He put out his hand to touch the dragon's scale, and he could sense a sharp aura gushing toward him. Sword intent was formless and intangible, and when it entered one's body, it was an indescribable feeling. It could only be said that the waves of piercing pain and slicing sensation allowed Fang Xijian to ascertain that there was indeed something that had come into contact with his body. Even the level 29 superior divine weapon, the Heavenly Abyss annihilation armor, was unable to fend it off. Fang Xijian could sense that there seemed to be something flowing in his consciousness. Do you want these sword techniques? If you do, then come and get them. As long as you lend me your powers, you can have any sword techniques you want. Fang Xijian then continued to send out the information about the rebirth sword intent bit by bit, continuing to tempt the Heaven's Volition sword intent in the dragon's scale. A few hours passed by, and the sword intent grew increasingly restless. It was like a snake coiling around Fang Xijian's body. However, it was guarding its bottom line, refusing to enter Fang Xijian's body completely. Finally, Fang Xijian's countenance turned grim, and he sent out all the information about the rebirth sword intent. He then sent out another stream of ether sword ripples, slashing onto the dragon's scale. My talent in sword arts is the best in the world. If you want sword arts, I'm the best choice. Sensing the endless greed, hunger, and other desires coming from the dragon's scale, Fang Xijian laughed out loud and said, "Come on, as long as you lend me your powers, I can lend you any sword techniques you want. As long as I'm still alive, I'll definitely become the world's strongest swordsman and create the world's strongest sword technique. If you want it, then come over." Chapter 3:18. At the next moment, the entire dragon's scale started to tremble intensely, as if it was excited and agitated by Fang Xijian's words. The atmosphere let out ear-piercing cries, and Fang Xijian could sense that there seemed to be something boiling in the space. Even the density of the ether particles in the surroundings had gradually increased. At the next moment, he felt an extremely sharp aura gushing into his brain, as if wanting to drill into his consciousness. Ah! This time around, it was not a simple information flow like the previous time. Instead, the entire sword intent had darted in. Fang Xinjian felt as if his brain was going to be sliced into pieces and then explode. In that instant, it was as if 10,000 years had passed. Fang Xinjian felt as if his eyes had seen an endless amount of information. However, this information had only stopped at the surface layer of his consciousness for less than 0.1 seconds before drilling into the depths of Fang Xinjian's consciousness together with the Heaven's Volition sword intent. Sensing that his consciousness had slowly turned from boiling water to a calm lake, Fang Xinjian let out a deep breath. Have I succeeded? He looked at his technique's stats window and discovered that there was now an additional skill called the Heaven's Volition sword intent. He then released his Heaven's perception and sank into his consciousness, looking at his skill seeds. Therefore, he discovered that the skill seeds of the various sword techniques were emitting a faint glow, revolving around the waves and mental cultivation method as the center. Then, with the appearance of the Heaven's Volition sword intent, the skill seed that he had manifested flashed with a glow like that of the sun. It forcefully knocked away all the other skill seeds and dashed to the center, causing the prodigious astral divine powers waves and the universal sword dominance lunisolar to revolve around it. Beyond that were the skill seeds of various sword technique. Fang Xinjian looked at the Heaven's Volition sword intent's introduction. This skill did not have a level, and the introduction was very simple. Natural selection, survival of the fittest. Possesses the ability to evolve endlessly and improve endlessly. After using it, the user can borrow the power of the Heaven's Volition sword intent to engage in battle. Every second, 100,000 potential points are depleted. Looking at this introduction, Fang Xinjian even felt that this was not a real sword technique. It was purely borrowing the power of the Heaven's Volition sword intent to battle, and it even depleted 100,000 potential points every second. Moreover, Fang Xinjian could sense that the Heaven's Volition sword intent in his consciousness would be stirring at any moment. He could imagine that once his sword techniques stopped progressing and he did not learn any new sword techniques, this Heaven's Volition sword intent would probably leave him. Rather than saying that it was a technique, this Heaven's Volition sword intent felt more like a weapon, or rather, heretical god force? Fang Xinjian's eyes narrowed. Sacrificing things in exchange for external power, isn't it similar to the diabolic force of the Mageweth? How powerful would it be if it consumed 100,000 potential points every second? But from the looks of it, it seems to strengthen my strength, and not a specific attack. However, right now, Fang Xinjian did not have 100,000 potential points that he could consume. He could only save up 30,000 potential points a day, and he would need 4 days to accumulate 100,000 potential points. After temporarily understanding the concept of the Heaven's Volition sword intent, Fang Xinjian lifted his head and looked at the dragon's scale. The dragon's scale, which had lost the Heaven's Volition sword intent, was no longer emitting a crimson-red glow. It did not even have the characteristic of fluctuating between hot and cold anymore. Fang Xinjian looked at the dragon's scale and suddenly smiled. He then looked at his stats window. His ether synchronization rate had already reached 28%. Although he had to divert his attention to analyze the dragon's scale during this period of time, the long period of time spent analyzing the waves of ether particles had not caused the rate at which his ether synchronization rate was increasing. He once again recalled what that female teacher had said previously. When a conferred knight's ether synchronization rate reached 30%, they would be able to see all sorts of light and sound wave. At the same time, they would be able to channel information currents into other physical substances, just like how the melancholic monarch had created the Pantheon Monument or the Heavenly Abyss Annihilation Armors will impact. Since you're being heartless, then don't blame me for being unjust. Since he was certain that Sasa was the one who had reported the matter of the hidden injuries to the association, Fang Xinjian was not someone to be trifled with. Therefore, he would not let Sasa off so easily. Then you can go back first. You can come back after my synchronization rate reaches 30%. Under Fang Xinjian's urging, the heaven's volition sword intent reluctantly returned to the dragon's scale. Therefore, the dragon's scale once again turned crimson red, once again emitting auras that alternated between hot and cold. The heaven's volition sword intent was a type of wave that had information or will channeled into it. Its power lay in the fact that the person who channeled it could rely on their will or information to interfere with the physical world. Therefore, the heaven's volition sword intent, which had been channeled with the same information, could also interfere with the physical world directly, causing Fang Xinjian to be able to borrow its power. Chapter 319. Just 1 hour ago, in the sacred land with 100 times. James hurried over to Fang Xinjian's training room, feeling a little worried. The arbitration team sent by the association will be arriving in 1 or 2 days. Xinjian hasn't been to the sword tower for a few days. Is he really too young and unable to keep his composure? Thinking of this, he knocked on the door and shouted, "Xinjian, are you there?" The training rooms in the sacred land all had defense mechanisms. Even James would not be willing to barge in recklessly. Not long later, the door opened. Fang Xinjian threw a glance at James, then turned and walked back to the training grounds, continuing to cultivate the aquatic sword formation. Streams of aquatic sword cheese could be seen gathering together, turning into a long river in midair. It flowed to and fro like a great river, releasing rumbling sounds. When James saw this scene, he was slightly stunned and said, "You still have the mood to cultivate the aquatic sword formation?" This was completely different from how he had imagined Fang Xinjian to be. Fang Xinjian said calmly, I wish to make good use of the time to cultivate it. It can be considered as a change of mind." A change of mind? After reading too many ancient era's words, it's good to have a change of mind. James nodded. There's still 1 or 2 more days before the arbitration team arrives. I've already contacted all the teachers in the Sword Arts Department. They'll help you hold the fort. The few headmasters from the Prefectural Academy in the Great Western region will also be coming. It's a pity that the national selection next year is too important, and the old men from the other regions are making good use of the time to train their students. Otherwise, I'll definitely call them over. Fang Xinjian nodded. Until now, he had yet to receive a reply from the second prince, the northern ice region's Relings, or the Holy Orison. He sighed inwardly, thinking that he could only rely on himself. James continued, "The arbitration isn't complicated. They'll first investigate the condition of the 3 students' internal injuries, then question the witnesses we provided one by one, as well as your situation. Of course, in order to show fairness, the entire arbitration process will be made public. You must be prepared to face pressure." Fang Xinjian nodded. He felt that this association's arbitration was a little similar to the lawsuits on Earth. It was just that in the Empire, the testimonies of experts and the authority of various experts far surpassed the testimonies and evidence of ordinary people. This was especially so in an arbitration related to swordsmanship. Whichever side had a more authoritative witness would have a higher chance of winning. James comforted him, "Don't worry, I've asked around. This time, other than a few brats from the association and the people from that dojo, no one else will fight against us. Our chances of winning are very high. If it was just a simple proof of swordsmanship, James would have nothing to worry about. However, he understood that the matter before him was no longer a simple proof of swordsmanship. Recently, various warnings and reminders, be they overt or covert, had been presented to him one after another. Even with his experience, he still felt a great deal of pressure. But looking at Fang Xinjian, who was still growing, he felt a sense of comfort. Seems like I'll still have to hold on for a while longer, until Fang Xinjian and the others' generation have matured. Fang Xinjian continued to cultivate the aquatic sword formation. At the next moment, countless streams of aquatic sword cheese condensed into a huge wave, turning the entire room into a world of water. Fang Shijian's aquatic sword formation had finally reached level 40. It was also at this moment that his eyes narrowed slightly. More information than before kept on gushing into his consciousness, and his heaven's perception received even more information. With the improvement in his sword arts, Fang Xinjian's ether synchronization rate also improved slightly, reaching 30%. At this moment, countless light waves and sound waves started to gush into his brain, and he started to see light and sound. This was a feeling that was many times more amazing than seeing light with one's eyes and hearing with one's ears. Sight was when one's eyes reflected light, and hearing was when one's ears felt vibrations in the air. It was because there was a limit to the frequency at which one could see light and the frequency at which one could feel the vibrations in the air. Right now, Fang Xinjian's ether synchronization rate had reached 30%. In that instant, he was able to see a reality that he had previously been unable to see. It was a world where he could see invisible light, infrasound, and ultrasound waves. The entire world seemed to have become extremely bizarre at this moment. However, it was also because he was able to see light and sound that even though Fang Xinjian's heaven's perception only had a range of 10 meters, he could still sense extremely far away places through the refraction of light and sound. At this stage, although he was blind, his vision and hearing far surpassed that of ordinary people. James looked at Fang Xinjian's dazed expression and asked, "What's wrong, Xijian?" "Oh right. Your ether synchronization rate is about to reach 30%, right? This heavenly barrier is very powerful and dangerous. It's because we humans are already used to seeing and hearing. It can be said that what we see and hear is what we think the real world is. However, when your ether synchronization rate reaches 30%, you'll be able to see a corner of the real world. To put it simply, everything won't be the same as before. The colors, shapes, trajectories, and other things will all change. Your sense of beauty, preferences, habits, and other senses will all go through a tremendous change. Moreover, once you step out, you won't be able to return. You'll have to experience all these for 24 hours. If your will is slightly weaker, you might go insane and become a lunatic. Remember, after your ether synchronization rate reaches 29%, you mustn't get close to the sacred land. I'll personally help you prepare to fast, bathe, burn incense, and stabilize your mind. You'll have to be careful even after you pass this stage. You'll have to slowly learn to filter out these information. Otherwise, if you're immersed in it, your mental state will get increasingly worse. Thinking of this, James let out a soft sigh. At his age, he had seen too many conferred knights who had reached this stage. Because they could not stand the way the real world was like, they would either go crazy or cripple their powers in order to return to their original world. Each step taken by a conferred knight was extremely arduous. It could be said that they were constantly moving from a human to an inhuman direction. As he spoke, James looked at Fang Xinjian, who was frowning slightly, and asked, "What's wrong? Are you not feeling well?" "Oh, it's nothing." Fang Xinjian shook his head slightly, and got used to the discomfort brought about by the 30% increase. He said calmly, "My ether synchronization rate has reached 30%. Please arrange for some ferocious beasts for me to gain experience." "Oh, your ether synchronization rate has reached 30%? Alright, I'll arrange for some ferocious beasts." Halfway through his words, James lifted his head abruptly and looked at Fang Xinjian as if he was looking at a ghost. "Your ether synchronization rate is 30%? How long has it been, and you've already leveled up? And didn't I tell you not to level up in the sacred land? What about the heavenly barrier? You weren't affected, were you? With an ether synchronization rate of 30%, you'll receive all sorts of light and sound waves in this stage. The entire world will be turned upside down in your eyes, and many conferred knights will even go crazy." Fang Xinjian turned his head. Right now, the world in his eyes was filled with densely packed light and sound waves. All the colors were no longer the same as before, and everyone looked distorted and deformed compared to before. All the voices also sounded out of tune. It felt as if the entire world's style had changed. Without a strong spirit and will, one would probably really go crazy. It's because what you see and hear are different, and your sense of beauty is still the same as before. However, the people around you all look like alien monsters, and all the objects are disgusting as if they came from hell. There are many colors and distortions that were not there before. However, given how intelligent Feng Xinjian was, the 10 heavenly stages posed no difficulty to him at all. He shook his head and said calmly, "I've already gotten used to it. There's no problem." Chapter 320. James looked at Feng Xinjian in a daze. But this. He let out a breath, sorted out his thoughts, and then said, "You're not affected by the 10 heavenly barriers? Didn't you feel any impact to your mind?" "Impact? Did I?" Feng Xinjian said calmly. "I just felt a little uncomfortable, but I'm basically fine now." "A little uncomfortable?" James smiled bitterly. Back then, when his ether synchronization rate had reached 30%, his entire view of the world had almost collapsed. Everyone's appearances and voices had changed beyond recognition. When he saw that food had turned into something that looked like *T, and when he heard the sound of the wind, he felt like a ghost. It was really easy for him to go crazy. However, Feng Xinjian had managed to get past this stage while talking and laughing. It was really... James did not know how to describe it. In any case, even he felt a sense of jealousy. This kind of talent was really a little scary. Usually, only when a conferred knight's cultivation gradually increased and they were able to interfere and filter the information from light rays and sound waves would they be able to ignore a portion of the truth and see the truth in the eyes of ordinary people. However, Feng Xinjian did not care about this. "I'll have to trouble you with the arbitration. It's my turn to study the ancient era's relics today, right? My ether synchronization rate has increased. I'll go and try again." After returning to the sword tower an hour later, Sasa had just finished his words when he saw Feng Xinjian pushing open the door and walking in. "Xinjian, you're here?" Sasa smiled. "Haven't you been very busy recently? It's fine even if you don't come." Feng Xinjian threw a cold glance at Sasa and said, "Everyone, go out. It's my time now." The corners of Sasa's lips twitched, and he let out a cold snort. In the end, he still brought everyone out. Feng Xinjian walked up to the dragon's scale. "Come out." In that instant there seemed to be something agitated in the air. Feng Xinjian once again experienced the intense pain of having 10,000 swords piercing through his heart. The Heaven's Volition sword intent was once again channeled into Feng Xinjian's mind. Looking at the deathly still dragon scale before him, Feng Xinjian smiled and touched it. In an instant, a stream of information flowed into the dragon scale. The so-called sword intent was also a type of information flow. The difference was that the sword intent mainly contained sword theories and emotions towards the sword Tao. The powerful aspect of the Heaven's Volition sword intent was that it could simply use information to interfere with the physical world. From Feng Xinjian's point of view, this could only be done by a high god realm master. Right now, he was writing out sets of sword theories and various feelings he had towards sword arts, turning them into information currents and channeling them into the dragon's scale. Of course, it was impossible for him to use his real sword theory. What he used was a fake sword theory that he fabricated. He remembered that when he was young, he was especially fond of the contents of a wuxia book, and he recalled the understanding of the way of the sword in it. Sister Gui pursues Wu Wang pursues Tongren pursues Dewei. Jia turned to Bing to Gung to Gui. Friends of Zi and Chou, friends of Chun and Si, friends of Wu and Wei. Wind and thunder changed, mountains and swamps changed, and so did water and fire. Qian and Kuan stimulated each other, Zhen and Dui stimulated each other, and Li and Sun stimulated each other. 3 increases to 5, 5 increases to 9. After doing all these, the dragon's scale once again turned crimson-red due to the channeling of information currents, exuding both scorching and cold auras. After doing all these, Fang Xinjian wanted to see how Sasa would court death. He was no longer willing to stay in the research room and continue putting on an act. Therefore, he returned to the sacred land to continue his cultivation. Elsewhere, a group of people from the center had also arrived at the great western city. The person in the lead was a beauty who appeared to be under 30 years of age. She had brilliant golden hair and a pair of sapphire eyes. The lady looked at the streets of the great western city and said coldly, "What era is it now? To think that there's still someone who dares to tamper with a self-created sword technique. To be able to cultivate nurturing sword techniques to the point of causing hidden injuries. What on earth are the association's upper echelon doing? How could they approve such a sword technique?" A subordinate smiled bitterly and said, "Sir, this Fang Xinjian is someone favored by the governor and the second prince. When you arrive at the great western city, it's best for you to be careful with your words and actions." "Even I have to be careful? Then is this His Majesty's country or Devit's, governor's, country?" The lady let out a cold snort and said, "The funds that the Empire allocates every year have been wasted by these vermin. To think that there's someone who tampers with nurturing sword techniques. This is a sword technique that even apprentices have to cultivate. By doing this, it's harming the people at the grassroots level and digging into the Empire's foundation. I definitely won't tolerate this. I'll give it my all in the arbitration this time around." Looking at this righteous-looking female officer, the other knights revealed a bitter smile. In the northern ice region, Rellings walked out from his room for training in seclusion. His face was filled with fury, and his eyes were filled with anxiety and bitterness. Why? How did things turn out like this? What on earth is wrong? Rellings cultivated saber arts. Although there were many similarities between saber arts and sword arts, if one were to make a serious comparison, there were still many differences. For example, saber arts focused on slashing, while sword arts focused on thrusting. This caused the way they battled to be very different, and there were also many differences in their daily cultivation. However, at Relling's level, both saber arts and sword arts were something he could pick up easily. Although his sword arts were not as powerful as his saber arts, they still far surpassed that of ordinary geniuses. However, this time around, when he was training in seclusion, he had wanted to change the rebirth sword technique into his own rebirth saber technique. However, he had encountered great difficulties. Moreover, seeing that he was unable to change such a powerful nurturing technique like the rebirth sword technique into his own saber arts, it was a great torment for him. He was like a kitten looking at dried fish but was unable to eat it. He was so anxious that he scratched his ears and cheek. The moment he came out, he grabbed onto his younger brother and asked, "Where's Fang Xinjian? Has he come? You guys invited him, right?" The man he had grabbed onto was a muscular man who bore a 70% to 80% resemblance to Rellings. Sensing that his body was being suppressed, he smiled bitterly and said, "We invited him, but he rejected. Damn it." However, his situation hasn't been too good recently. The central government has sent an arbitration team to the Great Western region. It seems that there's a problem with the rebirth sword technique. "There's a problem with the rebirth sword technique?" Rellings frowned and asked, "What problem?" The younger brother shrugged and said, "I heard that after a few apprentices cultivated the rebirth sword technique, they suffered from a certain degree of internal injuries. It seems that their internal organs have deteriorated." Ridiculous! Why would the trash from the central government believe in such a ridiculous theory? Fang Xinjian even sent a letter. It might be to ask for your help, the younger brother said carefully. His aptitude was not bad, but compared to his elder brother, Relling's, he was far too inferior. This caused him to be completely outshone by Relling's, and now, he was almost like Relling's follower. Where's the letter? Relling's tore open the letter roughly and started to scan through it. Oh, so that's how it is? Is it a problem with the circulation of vital energy and blood? It's probably in conflict with my waves? But how could he possibly know? It seems that this guy also circulates his waves day and night. After reading it for a few minutes, Rellings would occasionally let out a joyful grunt. This continued until his eyes suddenly widened and he let out a cold snort. What's going on? There's nothing else. He turned to look at his younger brother and asked, Where's the letter? There aren't any other letters? Seeing his younger brother shrugging, Rellings let out a sigh. How unlucky. This guy is putting out bait for me. However, he still said to his younger brother, pass me that piece of paper. Write me a letter to the Great Western Region Regional Academy. The younger brother's eyes opened wide and he said, Elder brother, you should know why things are like this, right? The situation here is too deep. The family hasn't even decided which side to stand on? What's that got to do with me? I don't know anything. What side? I don't know. I just feel that there's no problem with the rebirth sword technique. Just write it when I ask you to. The younger brother smiled bitterly and said, Elder brother, you really just charge in wherever there's the most trouble. What's there to be afraid of? There's nothing major apart from becoming a god. Let the mortals worry about their own matters. Chapter 321. On the other side, on the Yalan sacred mountain. On the snowy peak, a silhouette was dancing with a longsword on the snowy ground. Wherever the longsword passed by, the air would tremble and snowflakes would fly around. As different sword moves were performed, different trembling sounds would also ring out from within the body. It was as if there was thunder both inside and outside of the body. The cultivator's vital energy and blood were circulating in different ways according to the changes in the sword move. Llewellyn walked over as well. Looking at the scene of sword cheese flying around, he stroked his beard and sighed. This rebirth sword technique really lives up to its name. Its sword moves not only train the muscles and organs, but also the bones. It can completely change one's physique and stimulate one's potential from the root. Brother Huang Lin, your sword arts have improved tremendously again over the past month. The cultivator stopped his cultivation, and in that instant, a tremendous amount of heat was released from his entire body. It was as if he had turned into a huge furnace. This was because his entire body had been trained, and a tremendous amount of heat energy had to be released. A large portion of the surrounding snow melted in that instant. Huang Lin laughed and said, This rebirth sword technique is too complicated. With my cultivation, even after cultivating day and night, I've only managed to reach the first level. It's hard to imagine how long it would take for ordinary people to cultivate. It's worth it even if you were to cultivate for a few years. The effects of the rebirth sword technique is something that no other nurturing sword technique can compare to, Llewellyn said, looking at Huang Lin. Huang Lin walked out from the snowy water, looked at Llewellyn energetically, and said, Has the Guardian King made his decision? I can go to the great western city now, right? Haha, are you still in a hurry to testify for your disciple? Llewellyn smiled. Actually, even if you don't go, the more the truth is debated, the clearer it will be. They'll eventually prove that there's no problem with the rebirth sword technique. But the process of proving it probably won't be easy, right? The pressure from the various parties is too great. It's better for me to make a trip and cut the Gordian knot, saving them from wasting too much time and resources. Llewellyn sighed. Thinking of Fang Xinjian's face, he still felt an indescribable emotion. He stretched out his hand and handed a letter to Huang Lin. This is a letter that Master took some time to write. He has already cultivated the rebirth sword technique to level 10 and is able to gain about 8,000 potential points every day. Of course, this is also related to master's cultivation level. However, at the very least, it shows how powerful the rebirth sword technique is. Bring this letter to the great western city. A hint of surprise flashed in Huang Lin's eyes. Lord Guardian King is willing to testify for Xinjiang? It's not just testifying. A complicated look appeared in Yueluan's eyes. Master submitted Fang Xinjiang's information to the north. He wants to invite him to join the martial techniques grading plan. The so-called martial techniques grading plan was a super plan prepared by the Holy See of Truth in recent years. The plan was to divide all the martial skills in the world into different categories and grade. For example, in nurturing sword techniques, the rebirth sword technique should be considered a high-level sword technique, while the grizzly bear sword technique and eagle sword technique should be considered low-level sword technique. But how high was it? How low was it? There has never been a unified standard. The martial techniques grading plan was to test the effects and growth potential of all the martial techniques, and finally divide the effects and power of all the martial technique. How many martial skills were there in the world? How many people in the entire miracle world were cultivating martial techniques? Once this plan was carried out, it would consume an enormous amount of resources. At the same time, if this plan succeeded, it would also change and benefit the entire world. Only the Holy See of Truth, which had once unified the entire North and was still the strongest organization on the mainland, could do such a thing. Hearing this, Huang Lin was also stunned for a moment. He asked, "The Guardian King wants Xinjiang to join this plan as well?" Yueluan smiled and said, "That's right. With the martial techniques grading plan, even if we are only in charge of a small portion of the sword techniques, the number of secret manuals and cultivation resources we will be able to see will be astronomical. This is a great thing." Yueluan's mind couldn't help but think of Fang Xinjiang's face. He sighed in his heart, "Master, why did you place him under the noble's eyes so early in the morning? What are you planning to do? Besides, is it really a good idea for us to get involved in this whirlpool of the empire?" In the commoner's district in the great western city, Sally, the arbitrator from the central government, walked slowly into a small alley. Before she got close, she was already covering her nose. A foul smell came gushing out. It was clear that the hygiene in the commoner's district was too bad, making Sally feel very uncomfortable. One of her subordinates walked up and asked, "Madam, we'll just go in. You can just wait outside. Don't say any more. I can hold on." Sally took in a few light breaths, took some time to get used to it, and then headed deeper into the commoner's district. "But why are they still staying in a place like this? Didn't we say that we've already found them and even started to protect them? They aren't too cooperative and aren't too willing to follow us. Therefore, we got them to hide and then sent people to protect them." Along the way, all Sally saw were numb gazes, greedy gazes, and fearful emotions. It's too tough for the commoners of the empire's lower class. The entire country still has a long way to go. Sally then thought of Fang Xinjiang and clenched her fist. This be ****. For the sake of his own glory, he doesn't care about the situation of the commoners at all. The group of people walked up to a small house, knocked on the door, pushed it open, and entered. They saw a skinny young man lying on the bed. A little girl walked out and looked at them warily and fearfully. She asked, "Who are you guys?" Sally smiled, looked at the little girl, and said, "Hello, don't be afraid. We're arbitrators from the central government. We're here to look for Mike. Is Mike around?" The little girl subconsciously turned and looked at the young man on the bed. That skinny young man sat up. His eyes were sunken and bloodshot, and his face was pale. It was obvious that he was malnourished. He looked at Sally warily and asked, "You guys are arbitrators?" "Yes, arbitrators from the Night Association." Sally walked over and said in a gentle voice, We're here because of the rebirth sword technique. Is it because you've cultivated the rebirth sword technique that your internal organs have deteriorated? Mike was stunned for a moment. Then he lowered his head abruptly and mumbled, "What's the use of investigating? I'm already a cripple." "Of course it's useful," Sally said with a righteous expression. Sally said righteously, "If you don't step forward this time around, there'll be even more victims. If we're unable to prove that there's a mistake with the rebirth sword technique, it'll cause even more people to suffer from internal organs deteriorating like you. Therefore, we need your help." Seeing that Mike did not show any reaction, Sally slowly started to sense his body. As a level 25 conferred knight with an ether synchronization rate of over 60%, Sally was already able to sense the existence of cells and bacteria. She also had an accurate grasp of the human body. With this, her eyes opened slightly, and flames of fury burned in her heart. Chapter 322. Sally could sense that Mike's stomach was like the stomach of a dying old man. Not only was it completely curled up, but it was also like a decaying tree root, with most parts of it starting to rot and die. The stomach was extremely important, especially during the apprentice period. It was the most important place for the human body to absorb nutrient. Now that his stomach was severely failing, it was not just a problem of him not being able to cultivate. Mike might even die. How could Sally not be infuriated at the sight of this? Her eyes seemed as if they were going to spew out fire. What utter disregard for human life! How can a true nurturing sword technique cause one's internal organs to fester? To think that Feng Xinjian would even release such a sword technique for his own benefit. One of her subordinates coughed and said, "Madam, we're here to enforce the law impartially. It's best not to take a stand. Moreover, in terms of sword theory, the rebirth level doesn't have any major flaws." "Sword theory? Flaws?" Sally said furiously. "Look at these kids. This is the result of your sword theory. They're just mere humans. Just because they know some sword theory, they think that it's the truth of this world? Who do you think you are? All of you are like this. Just because you've grasped some extraordinary powers, you think of yourselves as gods. Are you going to ignore the facts that are right before your eyes? Even if it passes in terms of sword theory, as long as there's a 1 in 10,000 chance of harm, we have to stop it from being spread. Isn't this our duty? Is this the power that you believe in, the sword theory that caused such a tragedy?" One of her subordinates said, "Madam, we should at least wait for the arbitration to end before we can say the results." "Is there still a need for an arbitration?" Under her subordinate's strong gazes, Sally did not continue speaking. Instead, she looked at Mike with a pained expression and asked, "Mike, tell us everything you know. When did you start feeling stomach pain? What did you cultivate? What did you eat? And how was your daily routine?" In the following day, Sally visited a total of 3 apprentices who had met with mishap, as well as the teachers, other apprentices, and staff of the dojo. The results were very shocking to her. From what she asked, everything seemed normal, except for the fact that Mike and the others had cultivated the rebirth sword technique. From this point, it seemed that the cause of the entire incident was also the rebirth sword technique. This kind of swordsmanship can actually pass the association's examination. Sally gritted her teeth and said, "Inform the people from the Great Western Region Regional Academy that the arbitration will begin 3 days later. Get them to make their preparations. I want to see how they're going to explain themselves. After this arbitration, I'll apply to stop all exchanges and learning activities related to the rebirth sword technique as soon as possible and put him on the list of prohibited items." "That's right. Take them away and protect them. We can't let them get hurt again. The mistakes of adults shouldn't be borne by these children." In the office of Head of Department James in the Great Western Region Regional Academy, 7 to 8 senior teachers from the Sword Arts Department were gathered. Other than Hops, who was focused on his research and was unable to come, These were the few most amazing people in the sword arts department. At this time, Fang Xinjian was standing behind James, quietly enduring the crowd's gaze. James said, "The arbitration team sent by the central government has already arrived at the great western city. They just went to take a look at the 3 injured students. All of their internal organs have suffered from severe deterioration, and their lives are in danger. The arbitration will probably be held in a few days' time." A conferred knight with a big beard said impatiently, "What else is there to say about this? Those who truly understand sword arts, and have sufficient sword arts cultivation, wouldn't think that there's a problem with the rebirth sword technique. This sword technique was refined from the essence of several nurturing sword techniques. If there's a problem with it, wouldn't that mean that there's a problem with the other nurturing sword techniques as well?" A female conferred knight said, "Things aren't that simple. The rebirth sword technique will affect everyone in the entire empire. It's possible that the higher-ups haven't thought of how to handle such a bomb." Hearing that, Fang Xinjian blinked. It was as if he had just realized that the rebirth sword technique might not be something that many people in the empire would be happy to see. James interrupted them and said, "All right, stop arguing. In any case, the people from the association have come looking for us, but no matter what, Xinjian is one of us. We can't let the people from the central government do as they please. Therefore, this time around, we must stand united against the outsiders. The reason why I've asked you guys to come over is to unify our thoughts. Don't drag me down during the arbitration." "Don't worry, head of department. How can we drag you down? This time around, the association is just messing around. 3 people are injured, and they want to blame it on the sword technique? I think there's someone behind this. A bunch of people who don't know anything about sword arts would think that this is a problem with the rebirth sword technique. A sword technique like this should be popularized. I also hope that my son and grandson will be able to cultivate a sword technique like the rebirth sword technique in the future." James nodded in satisfaction. "All right, you guys can go now. Perform well during the arbitration, but don't go overboard. Just tell the truth." Watching as everyone slowly left, James nodded and said, "When the time comes, Governor Devitt, the few deputy governors, and the regional chief will all be here as witnesses. Don't worry, you're now a member of our regional academy. We won't let you suffer any losses." Fang Xinjian nodded. "Thank you, head of department. There's no need to thank me. Just work hard and don't waste your talent. That'll be my greatest consolation." James suddenly asked, "Oh right? I heard that you haven't been to the sword tower for the past few days? Have you been affected? Don't let it affect you. Just do what you should be doing." "I know. I'm not affected. It's good that you're not affected. You should cultivate and decipher the ancient texts. With me around, even if the association's chief comes, he won't be able to do anything to you." James' countenance sank slightly. They had sent people to search for the 3 brats for so long, but they had not been able to find them. Now that the people from the arbitration team had seen them the moment they arrived, how could he possibly believe that there was nothing fishy going on? "Head of department, the pressure this time around is very great, right?" Fang Xinjian suddenly looked at James and asked, "The arbitration this time around is no longer as simple as proving whether or not the rebirth sword technique is harmful, right?" James looked at him and smiled, saying, "Hee, it's nothing. This is our matter. You just focus on your research." "Oh right. When are you going to give me the remaining 4 levels of Mysteries of the Pantheon Monument?" Fang Xinjian continued to stare at him. Their gazes met, as if neither of them was willing to give in. However, James was still the one who shook his head and said, "It's useless even if you know about it. It'll only add to your worries and affect your cultivation. Why do you have to do this?" The pressure was too great. Thinking of the people who had been coming to visit him, asking him questions and pleading for him, James really did not wish for such pressure to be passed on to Fang Xinjian. It would affect his cultivation and research too much. Fang Shijian continued. Anyway, you won't be able to hide it anymore. Are you still not planning to say it? James' lips twitched. It's just that some old fools are unwilling to give up on the small benefits before them and want to hinder the world's development. They should be the ones who are under more pressure. Hinder the world's development. Fang Shijian lowered his head and started to think. Wasn't the second prince's faction the reformist faction? Then the rebirth sword technique would be able to increase the power of the commoners and weaken the influence of the royal family and factions. This would mean that the solidified social classes would be weakened to a certain extent, increasing the mobility of the people and opening up a path for the reformist faction. What role did the second prince play in this entire matter? Fang Shijian thought. Is that why the Academy is so supportive of me reporting the rebirth sword technique? They've long seen the possibility of this sword technique being able to help them reform this empire and speed up the process of breaking the rigid rule of the current social classes. Fang Shijian could not help but admit that compared to these people's political sensitivity, his thinking in this area was still too immature. While he was still focusing on his sword arts, the second prince had already started to use the rebirth sword technique to set up his plans for the world and had started to fight openly and covertly against the resistance forces. However, Fang Shijian did not mind. He only liked sword arts to begin with, and he only wanted to use sword arts to solve problems. This was his style. After leaving James' office, he headed for the sacred land. On the way, he saw Rhoda walking over, and there were two black-clothed men whom Fang Shijian had never seen before. Chapter 323. Looking at Fang Shijian, Rhoda forced a smile. How have you been? Fang Shijian looked at the two people behind Rhoda and asked calmly, What happened? Nothing much. Rhoda fell silent for a moment before suddenly asking, Shijian, what do you think of the rebirth sword technique? It's a good sword technique. Just as Fang Shijian said this, the man in black behind Rhoda walked out and said, All right, Rhoda, stop dragging things out. Let me get straight to the point. This man in black had white hair and a ruddy complexion, but his gaze was cold and sinister. His lips were very thin and pale, and he appeared to be a vicious and merciless person. The corners of the old man's lips curled down as he looked at Fang Shijian and said, Fang Shijian, the rebirth sword technique has great implications. Before you've completely researched the sword technique, you shouldn't spread it out. You're too careless in this aspect. You should cultivate for a few more years before creating your own sword technique. Fang Shijian threw a glance at Rhoda and asked, Who is this old man? The old man in black's eyes widened and he said furiously, It's really as the rumors say. What an arrogant lad. Rhoda frowned and said helplessly, Shijian, this is our clan's old ancestor. He left to cultivate 50 years ago and has never cared about us. Yet now, he wants us to pass a message to you. The old ancestor is already at second transition level 22. To the small aristocrats in the city where Rhoda was from, a level 22 conferred knight was already an important character who was like a god. However, there was not much respect in Rhoda's eyes. After all, this was the regional academy, and she had personally witnessed Fang Shijian defeating conferred knights many times. Since you've already left home, why did you come back? You weren't around when others needed you, but when they didn't, you popped out. How could a level 22 conferred knight be of any importance to Fang Shijian? He threw a casual glance at the old man in black and said, Scram. Don't interfere with Rhoda. Her talent is much higher than yours. Don't hold her back. Me? I'm delaying him? The black-robed old man was so infuriated that his lungs were about to explode. 50 years ago, he had left home and joined the Li River sect. He had trained hard in the sect and had finally reached second transition level 22. Which of the juniors would not tremble in fear when they saw him? This time, he was ordered by the sect master to talk to Fang Shijian. Who would have thought that this Fang Shijian would actually give him no face at all? Fine, fine, fine. You think I won't dare to do anything to you just because you have James and Holden behind you? I'll make a move now. I want to see what they can do to me without you by my side." As he spoke, the black-robed elder stretched out his hand and a stream of blood shot out from his palm. In the blink of an eye, it transformed into a blood spear which stabbed towards Fang Xinjian. This myriad blood spear contained countless types of curses and poisons. With just a slight touch, it would seep into one's body through one's skin. By then, all sorts of extreme itchiness and pain would be felt, making it difficult for one to choose between life and death. The black-robed elder's arm trembled, and the blood spear turned into a wave of blood that gushed out towards Fang Xinjian, wanting to engulf his entire body and make him suffer. This wave of blood gushed up into the sky, as if a tsunami had appeared out of nowhere. That pungent smell of blood could almost cause ordinary people to faint from fright. If this wave of blood gushed out, it would probably be able to engulf an entire village. The moment the old man made his move, he displayed the tyrannical power of a level 22 conferred knight. Moreover, he did not hold back at all. He wanted to teach Fang Xinjian a good lesson. Humph, this damned lad. After being praised by a few old fools in the great western region, he no longer knows how high the heavens are and how deep the earth is. Just as the old man was thinking of this, Fang Xinjian tapped out with a finger, and over 1,000 streams of aquatic sword cheese gushed out, also turning into a tsunami and gushing out. However, compared to the old man's blood wave, the tsunami of over 1,000 streams of aquatic sword cheese was almost deafening, and its aura was many times more majestic. The tsunami formed from over 1,000 streams of aquatic sword cheese turned into a huge palm and smashed out fiercely. Just the shock waves formed from the tremors in the air caused the old man's blood wave to dissipate with a loud boom. They were both level 22 conferred knights, but Fang Xinjian's aquatic sword formation was at level 40, while the old man's myriad blood spear was only at level 15. How could they be a match for each other? The old man bellowed furiously, and streams of blood waves smashed toward the huge palm formed from the tsunami. The blood waves, which had a pressure of several hundred kilograms per square meter, could smash anyone into the ground like the scene of a car accident. However, they were unable to do anything to Fang Xinjian's aquatic sword cheese. The streams of blood waves were torn apart and crushed. In the end, the old man in black was sent flying by the huge palm. He spurted out a large mouthful of blood in midair, and it was unknown how many bones he had broken. Damn it, to think that this Fang Xinjian is so powerful? Could it be that he relied on his own abilities to clear the entire Killing Techniques palace? He's only 17 years old. How is this possible? Even when he had fallen to the ground, his eyes continued to stare at Fang Xinjian, as if he could not understand how Fang Xinjian could be so much stronger than him. You're only at level 22, struggling at death's door. You're not even as powerful as I was when I was at level 20. Fang Xinjian shook his head and said, Rhoda, only the regional academy's second transition and killing techniques are the way to the throne. Don't follow his example and take the unorthodox path, learning the martial arts of some small sections. You'll only end up harming yourself and others. For the old man to be able to go through the second transition and reach level 22, although he had expended a lot of hard work and had reached the limits of his talent, even using various secret techniques from the Li River sect, this had always been the thing that he was most proud of. How could he tolerate such criticism from Fang Xinjian? This was especially so when it came to the words small sects. It hit him where it hurt the most. When the old man heard this, he was so infuriated that he spurted out a large mouthful of blood and almost fainted. Looking at the old ancestor who was lying on the ground like a drowned rat, Rhoda looked at Fang Xinjian in astonishment. The last time she had seen him clearing the Killing Techniques palace, Fang Xinjian had not been so powerful. To think that he could now defeat a level 22 conferred knight with a single move. She had seen Fang Xinjian's performance in the Killing Techniques Palace previously and knew that her old ancestor was probably not a match for Fang Xinjian. That was why she had brought him here, wanting to borrow Fang Xinjian's power to shake off the old ancestor's suppression. However, she had not expected that the old ancestor would not even be able to take a single move from him. Hearing Fang Xinjian's words, Rhoda's gaze narrowed. When she lifted her head again, she saw that Fang Xinjian had already left. She shouted loudly, "Fang Xinjian, I'll definitely not learn from him. I'll definitely complete the second transition in a dignified manner, break through the Killing Techniques Palace, and then walk right up to you." However, Fang Xinjian did not listen to her. The black-robed old man's arrival was a signal. If it could be said that the association had informed the Sword Arts Department to investigate themselves earlier so that they could comprehend it themselves and surrender, then the old man's arrival meant that the other party had seen that they were planning to fight to the end and was starting to exert real pressure on them. Otherwise, how could a second transition level 22 conferred knight possibly be so arrogant and enter so casually? Are they going to start with the people around me? Fang Xinjian seemed to be able to sense waves of invisible power pressing down on the Great Western region and the Great Western City. After returning to the training room, Fang Xinjian temporarily put aside his worries. It was useless for him to let his thoughts run wild. The most important thing now was to raise his abilities. Moreover, the second prince's faction would definitely go and fend off the real pressure. Therefore, he started to control the skill seeds in his consciousness to synthesize them. His aquatic sword formation was already at the maximum level of 40, and it was time for him to synthesize it with the Thunder Prison Earth Sword. Once he succeeded, he would have completed the third level of the Killing Techniques Palace's sword techniques, and he would be even closer to the final prodigious demolition sword. Chapter 324. After finding the seed that was flashing with azure blue light, Fang Xinjian pressed this skill seed toward the thunder-immuring earth sword. In that instant, he could sense countless streams of information flowing back and forth. Just as the skill synthesis was about to succeed, there was an explosive bang, and the aquatic sword formation's skill seed shattered completely. All the relevant information disappeared. Fang Xinjian sighed. If he were to fail, he would have no choice but to start cultivating again. Thankfully, he had already made sufficient preparations beforehand. Looking at the stone wall on the side, he saw that it was already filled with the contents of the aquatic sword formation. It even included his previous cultivation insights and experiences. Half an hour later, a stream of aquatic sword chi rose up from Fang Xinjian's palm. He started to cultivate the aquatic sword formation once again. He continued cultivating until that night. Fang Xinjian looked at the sky and narrowed his eyes. It should be about time. They had tried to look for the 3 students who had suffered from internal injuries during their cultivation, but they had not been able to find them. Therefore, they could only continue to strengthen the evidence of the rebirth sword technique. However, with the arrival of the arbitrators, the 3 students appeared one after another. Even their teacher, who had not been able to find them, had appeared in the Great Western City. Moreover, the situation was getting increasingly tense. The 3 letters he had sent out had yet to receive any reply. Therefore, he had to make early preparations. One of the methods was to find the 3 students and investigate the reason for their injuries. He had wanted to investigate the reason for their injuries a long time ago. However, they had been in hiding, and they had not been able to find them. Right now, they were together with the arbitrators and were no longer in hiding. Moreover, the matter of the rebirth sword technique was not simply about the sword technique's strengths and weaknesses. It also involved the fights between the Empire's upper echelons. Although he did not like such fights, he did not wish to be passive. Instead, he preferred to take the initiative to attack. Therefore, the detailed information was also what Fang Xinjian wanted to know. Moreover, He had absolute confidence in his own abilities. James had judged that with his sword arts and the existence of the Heavenly Abyss Annihilation armor, there were very few conferred knights who would be able to win against him unless they were at least level 25 or 26. Therefore, he took advantage of the darkness and left the academy, arriving at the great western city like a gust of night wind. At the same time, in the training room where Holt was, he was reading a letter. It was a letter from his master, a level 29 great expert, the disciple of a divine level expert, and an expert of similar status as the holy Orison's disciple Llewellyn Lawrence. Is that what Master and the others mean? Holt frowned. I've always felt that the rebirth sword technique is no longer just an academic debate. As expected, it has already implicated the interests of many top-notch influences. But is it really good to suppress it like this? Holt sighed and looked at the letter in his hand silently. But no matter what, he had to follow the contents of the letter. Once I present Master's letter during the arbitration and prove the flaws of the rebirth sword technique, Fang Xinjian's reputation would be ruined, right? Although Holt had always wanted to surpass Fang Xinjian, he had never thought that it would be through such a method. He shook his head and thought of how a genius who had created a revolutionary sword technique would end up being suppressed by everyone else because the sword technique he had created was too outstanding. Holt instantly felt a sense of sympathy for the death of a rabbit. It's a pity, Fang Xinjian. You were born in the wrong era. It seems that I won't have a chance to win against you anymore. It was because Holt knew that no matter how hard he worked, it would be impossible for him to win against a dead person. Elsewhere, Fang Xinjian was roaming around the great western city. Right now, not only had Fang Xinjian reached the pinnacle in his sword arts, but his attributes had also been continuously increasing due to the tremendous amount of resources he received every day. His attributes had become: name Fang Xinjian, age 17, occupation Heavenly Sword, sovereign level 22, strength 115 plus 8, agility 216 plus 8, reaction 112, endurance 88, flexibility 88, ether synchronization rate 31%. The attributes above come into effect once the prodigious astral divine powers waves is activated. Due to perfect muscles, plus 8 in strength and agility, 10% of the strength and agility attribute techniques. Boundaries negation, level 40 rebirth sword technique, level 40 new 9-headed dragon sword technique, level 40 zenith light sword formation, level 40 ether sword ripples, level 4 ether divine art, level 40 thunder prison earth sword, level 12 aquatic sword formation, level 1 lightless sword, heaven's volition sword, intent specialties. Genius swordsmanship, elementary survival instinct. Internal healing, internal training, sword specialist, heightened reflexes, perfect muscles, single sword world subjugation, elementary berserkness, unparalleled sword intent, apex, sword bones, swordless path, darkness sword sense. Heavenly Sword imprint waves, level 2 prodigious astral divine powers waves, mental cultivation method, level 5 universal sword dominance, lunisolar. Regardless of whether it was his attributes, techniques, or specialties, other than his ether synchronization rate, his abilities were comparable to that of a level 25 conferred knight. This was especially so when he had the Zenith Light Sword formation for long-range attacks, the Ether Sword ripples for close combat, the Thunder Prison Earth Sword for support, the explosive speed of Boundaries negation, and the explosive strength of Terra ingurgitation. His instantaneous explosive output was something that even a level 25 conferred knight could not compare to. Moreover, he still had the Heavenly Abyss Annihilation armor's ultimate defense, as well as the Heaven's Volition sword intent that was hidden in the center of his consciousness. In order to use the Heaven's Volition sword intent and Boundaries negation, which required potential points, Fang Xinjian had saved up a total of 120,000 potential points. Of course, this was only enough for the Heaven's Volition sword intent to use for 1 second. The Heaven's Volition sword intent required 100,000 potential points per second was simply too much. I wonder if there will be any whetstones that will allow me to use the Heaven's Volition sword chi today. It was as if a black line had swept across the night sky, and Fang Xinjian arrived at a small alley. Ferdinand was already waiting there. Ferdinand passed a piece of paper to Fang Xinjian and said, "They're all here now, being taken care of by the arbitration team. This time around, the arbitration team has sent a total of 3 conferred knights. All of them are around level 25. Are you sure you want to go? Isn't it very interesting to be able to train the rebirth sword technique to the point where one's internal organs are weakened and one's life is in danger?" Fang Xinjian took a look at the address written on it and with a light pinch, the piece of paper was torn into pieces by sword cheese. "I couldn't find them earlier. Since they've appeared this time around, I'll have to do some research on them." As he spoke, Ferdinand only felt a light breeze blowing past him, and Fang Xinjian had already disappeared into the night. Looking at the pitch-black night sky, Ferdinand seemed to be reminded of how Fang Xinjian had been in the past. In just a short 1.5 years, he's already grown to such a level. Right now, I probably won't even be able to withstand a single glance from him. After seeing Fang Xinjian again today, Fang Xinjian felt a little regretful about his decision to give up on focusing on his cultivation and gradually shift his focus to the background. Right now, he did not even know when Fang Xinjian had come or left. "My sharpness and sensitivity are getting worse and worse." Ferdinand pinched his forehead and sighed. "I hope that I didn't choose the wrong path." On the other hand, Fang Xinjian was moving very quickly, and in the blink of an eye, he had already arrived before a big house in the northwest corner. According to Ferdinand's information, the 3 severely injured apprentices were now placed here to recuperate and receive protection. Chapter 325. Fang Xinjian scanned the exterior of the house. Then with a flash, he appeared at the back door of the house as if he had teleported. At the same time, on the 3rd floor of the house, there were 3 young men and women lying on 3 beds. They were 3 apprentices whose internal organs had deteriorated and whose lives were in danger. One of the young ladies lay on the bed with a pale face. Her eyes were tightly shut, and her face was filled with agony. Large beads of perspiration dripped down from her forehead. 2 conferred knights dressed in night attire stood at a corner of the bed. One of them, a conferred knight with a small mustache, threw a glance at the young lady who was gasping for breath and moaning. He shook his head and said, "The 3 of them probably won't be able to last till next month." Next to him, the other blue-haired conferred knight said, "Their internal organs are deteriorating and rotting bit by bit. This way of dying is too painful. Let's go. Don't disturb their rest." The 2 conferred knights both had heaven's perception, so it did not matter whether they were inside or outside the door. They walked out together and sat down. The small mustache asked, "Where's Madame Sally? She hasn't returned yet?" The blue-haired man replied, "No, she's gone to investigate the situation at One Intention Dojo." One Intention Dojo was the sword arts faction which had met with trouble this time around. It was also their head who had gotten 3 of the more outstanding students in the dojo to try and learn it after reading the rebirth sword technique in the Knight's Handbook. One Intention style. Over 10 years ago, it was one of the more powerful factions in the great western city, right? Over the past 10 years or so, it has deteriorated greatly, the small mustache said. But it feels a little strange for him to get 3 of the most outstanding students to cultivate the rebirth sword technique at one go. What's so strange about it? The blue-haired man said, "They've deteriorated too much." He said that if there isn't a single knight to be born by next year, even their rights to read the Knight's Handbook will be revoked. The head must have believed in the effects of the rebirth sword technique and gotten the 3 most outstanding students to practice it. He's planning on using the excuse of not paying the authorization fee as an excuse to wait for the 3 students to get good results in the prefectural selection next year. In the end, 3 people just happened to be crippled? The small mustache man's lips twitched. They're really unlucky. The 2 of them were the adjutants who had rushed over to the great western city together with the arbitrator, Sally. They were also people from the Night Association and were in charge of assisting Sally in hosting the charge. However, compared to Sally, who was not even 30 years old, both the man with the mustache and the man with the blue hair were over 40 years old. They were also level 24 conferred knights and were considered to be the backbone of the conferred knight. Just as they were talking, a middle-aged woman came over. The woman's face was full of wrinkles and she was wearing coarse clothes. She looked uneasy under the light. She said timidly and nervously, I think we'd better forget it this time. Can you stop the arbitration? This commoner lady was clearly the mother of one of the 3 apprentices. Hearing her question, the 2 conferred knights exchanged a glance. In the end, it was the man with the mustache who said, You don't have to worry. We represent the Night Association. No one will dare to take revenge on you. But I heard that Fang Xinjian is a genius that has not appeared in the Great Western region for the past 1,000 years. I've even read his books. A character like this. How can we go against such a character? The lady continued to clench her fists, and her tone became increasingly nervous and uneasy. Seeing how the woman was behaving, the man with the mustache explained patiently, You don't have to worry about Fang Xinjian. We're all level 24 conferred knight. All of us skipped over the regional academies and trained hard in the Night Association in the central region. You might have heard of our names before. I'm Heaven-Shaking Sword, Potter. He patted his back, and a great sword that was over 2 meters long let out clanking sound. He then pointed to the blue-haired man and said, This is Baroque Sword, Marcus, and Fang Xinjian is just a conferred knight who has just transitioned not too long ago. With us around, he won't be able to do anything to you guys. You don't have to worry. This time around, the arbitration was for the rebirth sword technique, and the 3 arbitrators that were sent over were naturally people who cultivated sword art. Heaven-Shaking Sword, Potter, and Baroque Sword, Marcus, these 2 conferred knights were also people with some fame in the central region. Heaven-Shaking Sword, Potter, and Baroque Sword, Marcus, were both conferred knights who had quite a bit of fame in the central region. Or perhaps it was the Baroque Sword. Marcus had once stabbed 12,005 times in 10 minutes, stopping the ferocious beasts from besieging the city and saving tens of thousands of people. Furthermore, the 2 of them later became the Golden Partners and had worked together to deal with many night cases. 3 years ago, they had even worked together to capture a level 24 conferred knight who had defected to the north. Under the pursuit of assassins from the north, they had successfully brought the criminal back to the imperial capital. Although the woman was a commoner, she had heard of their deeds. Hearing this, she finally felt a little more at ease. However, she still said with some fear, But it's rumored that the second prince is backing Fang Xinjian. What if His Majesty the second prince gets angry at what we've done? What should we do? Seeing that the woman looked like she was about to cry, the blue-haired Marcus said impatiently, All right, don't think too much about this. Our Night Association is very particular about enforcing the law impartially. Even if a prince were to break the law, he would be punished the same as a commoner. If it's really proven that Fang Xinjian's rebirth sword technique has caused his internal organs to deteriorate, then even the second prince won't be able to save him. With that, he waved his hand and got the woman to quickly go back to rest. After the woman left, the mustache Potter said, Why do you have to be so crude? This woman is very worried right now. You should give her a good explanation. The blue-haired Marcus said, She's just a commoner. To be honest, regardless of whether she's angry, nervous, worried, or any other emotions, they won't affect the situation at all. Your heart is in a mess? Heaven-shaking Sword Potter asked. Aren't you in a mess? Baroque Sword Marcus let out a breath and said, although Fang Xinjian's talent is very strong, it hasn't been completely converted into his battle prowess. The terrifying ones are the people standing behind him. You've sensed it during the time you've been in the great western city, right? It's been very difficult. Heaven-shaking Sword Potter frowned and said, almost every place we go and everything we do are being monitored. Even this house took us a lot of effort to get our hands on it. Putting aside the various rude treatment we've received on the way here, we haven't even been able to meet James and Governor Devitt until now. Moreover, don't you feel that the waters are really that deep this time around? Both you and I cultivate sword art. At the very least, in terms of sword theories, the rebirth sword technique definitely won't cause one's internal organs to deteriorate. This matter should have been kept under wraps for the time being and investigated slowly. However, with such great fanfare and almost going against the Great Western Region Regional Academy, it's clear that they want to cut the Gordian knot and get all the organizations to stop their research on the rebirth sword technique. Saying that, Heaven-shaking Sword Potter let out a breath and said, right now, the entire upper echelon of the Empire knows about the rebirth sword technique. To think that only the three of us have been sent here, especially Sally. Although she's quite talented, she's too young and her experience is a little lacking. Chapter 326. You've sensed it as well? Baroque Sword Marcus said, you should understand that if the rebirth sword technique is real, then it could change the entire empire. No, it could change the entire world's way of cultivating. If such a thing were to appear, do you think, all right? When Baroque Sword said that, Heaven-shaking Sword Potter felt his hair stand on end. If the rebirth sword technique was real, then what effect would it have on the entire world's martial prowess? If it was real, then what would happen to the nurturing sword techniques from other factions? Then what would happen to the experts who had signed the nurturing sword techniques? And what would the government think when faced with the people from the middle and lower levels, as well as the knights and knight apprentices who were about to receive a huge leap in their abilities? Thinking of this, Marcus broke out in cold sweat. This time around, he had really been dragged into a huge whirlpool. What he could not understand was why they had only sent level 24 and 25 conferred knights like them over for such a huge matter. What on earth were the higher-ups planning? The two of them did not know what to do. It was because they had not received any orders and did not know what they should be biased toward. Moreover, the higher-ups had sent Sally, a woman who was easily moved and was also filled with righteousness. It seemed to be a form of attitude in itself. Just as the two of them were deep in thought, Fang Xinjian's voice rang out from the staircase. I see. You guys don't know the exact situation either? Who's that? With an explosive bellow, Baroque Sword Marcus and Heaven-shaking Sword Potter both looked toward Fang Xinjian. Crackling sounds of explosions rang out in the air, and the surrounding walls seemed as if they had been hit by an air bomb, with a large area of cracks appearing. Just the slight agitation of their reduced force fields seemed as if they were about to tear down the entire house. A lady's scream rang out, and the lady who had come to ask earlier rushed to Baroque Sword's side and asked, "What's wrong? What happened?" Baroque Sword Marcus bellowed, "Don't move recklessly if you don't wish to die." The two of them looked toward Fang Xinjian and asked, "Who are you?" "Me? Aren't I the person you guys are looking for?" Fang Xinjian walked slowly toward the two conferred knights, as if he was taking a leisurely stroll in the garden. However, the countenances of the two conferred knights changed. They stared at Fang Xinjian and asked, "Fang Xinjian, why are you here? The arbitration will begin in 3 days. What are you trying to do?" Fang Xinjian's feet stopped at the boundary of their reduced force fields and said calmly, "Don't be nervous. I'm only here to take a look at the 3 injured kids and find out the reason for their injuries." Heaven-shaking Sword Potter said coldly, "Go back. It's impossible for us to let you meet." Right at this moment, the middle-aged woman's expression changed drastically. She looked at Fang Xinjian and stammered, You are Fang Xinjian. What do you want to do? Are you here to kill us? Fang Xinjian frowned as he looked at the woman and asked, Who is he? He's a family member of one of the victims. Heaven-shaking sword Potter said, Marcus, bring Madame Daly back. I alone will be enough. The middle-aged woman who was addressed as Madame Daly was on the verge of breaking down. Tears gushed out incessantly as she looked at Fang Xinjian and shouted, Fang Xinjian, haven't you caused enough harm to my son? You're still thinking of killing him? I beg of you, please let us off. We don't want the arbitration anymore. Baroque sword Marcus shook his head. Looking at the woman who was speaking incoherently and even contradicting herself, he picked her up with one hand, wanting to bring her away. However, heaven-shaking sword Potter looked at Fang Xinjian from afar and said, Mr. Fang, why are you in a daze? Do you want me to send you away personally? Fang Xinjian did not say a word. He just opened up his 5 fingers, and a stream of aquatic sword chi turned into a water sword in his hand. I'm not in a daze. It's just that there are too many ways to defeat you. It's hard for me to choose. Humph. Heaven-shaking sword Potter let out a cold snort, drew out the huge sword that was over 2 meters long from his back, gritted his teeth and said, Arrogant brat. My level is higher than yours, my slaughter experience is 100 times more than yours, and the battles I've participated in are more than the meals you've eaten. What right do you have to fight against me? Go back quickly. I don't want others to find trouble with me after I injure you. No matter how much battle experience a weakling has, it's just experience from fighting against weaklings. After saying this, Fang Xinjian suddenly appeared behind heaven-shaking sword Potter, sending over 10 streams of ether sword ripples sweeping out. How fast was Fang Xinjian's current speed? With his 224 agility attribute, single sword world subjugation, and boundaries negation, his speed was not even 15 times that of supersonic speed. Additionally, the ether sword ripples could unleash a slash that was 5 times that of Fang Xinjian's strength. Moreover, after Fang Xinjian's growth and tempering after his job transition, his strength attribute had already reached 123 points, reaching the average standard of a low-tiered conferred knight. Right now, as the ether sword ripples swept out, Heaven-shaking sword was unable to react to the slash that was 15 times that of supersonic speed. He was sent flying, covered in blood, and landed on the ground. Of course, although it seemed like he had lost a lot of blood, Fang Xinjian had already avoided the vital parts. To Heaven-shaking sword, who was a conferred knight, it was just a superficial wound. Potter rolled on the ground and let out a furious bellow. His entire body swelled up as if he was congested with blood. He raised his huge sword high up, wanting to once again charge out toward Fang Xinjian. Just then, Fang Xinjian somehow appeared before him, and a water sword took advantage of the loophole in his movements. It instantly pierced through his body and stuck close to his heart, not moving at all. Sensing the feeling of the sword cheese sticking close to his heart, Heaven-shaking sword did not dare to move at all. Fang Xinjian then let go of his hand, and the water sword formed from the aquatic sword cheese turned into a lump, wrapping around Heaven-shaking sword's heart. Fang Xinjian whispered into Heaven-shaking sword's ear, "Stay here obediently. I'm not here to kill anyone today." Heaven-shaking sword's face was flushed red. He had not even unleashed 10% of his powers, yet he had been defeated so easily. He was covered in shame and fury. However, just then, another bang rang out. Fang Xinjian turned back and saw that Baroque sword Marcus had unknowingly fallen to the ground. Madame Daly was slowly drawing out a dagger from his body. She chuckled, "Thank goodness this guy isn't at level 25. Otherwise, it'd be troublesome for his body to regenerate. He wouldn't be able to lie down so quietly like now." You're tuning in to the Phoenix Knights YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.